What would you do if you discovered a truth so dangerous that the people closest to you tried to kill for it? I'm not talking about a small truth, not a white lie exposed, not a secret someone wanted kept quiet. I'm talking about the kind of truth that has the power to change history. The kind that gets you hunted by every government and institution on Earth. Tonight, we're going to travel across more than 2,000 years of human thought. Philosophy, science, art, medicine, politics, psychology, literature. You'll learn about 23 of the most dangerous minds in human history. 23 thinkers whose ideas were so threatening, so fundamentally destabilizing, that the most powerful institutions on Earth tried to silence them forever. Some of these names you'll recognize immediately, some you've never heard of in your life. And before we begin, let me make you a promise. By the time you reach the end of tonight's journey, you won't see the world quite the same way. I mean that, because these 23 stories aren't just about dangerous ideas. They're about what happens to the human beings who carry those ideas. The real, breathing, frightened, stubborn, sometimes broken people who refused to unsee what they'd seen. Some were tortured, some were burned alive, some were driven to madness. Some lost everything they had, their careers, their families, their freedom, their sanity, and a few lost their lives. But here's what's remarkable. Not one of these ideas stayed buried, not one. Every single dangerous idea on tonight's list eventually won. Some took decades, some took centuries, but they all won. The truth, it turns out, is patient. It can wait. Welcome, Nightlings. This is Huxley. Now, you know I love sharing wisdom with you here. But I have to tell you about something new. Because some stories are too vivid, too wild to be shared here. Imagine drifting off tonight, but you're standing on the deck of Blackbeard's ship, salt air on your face. Tomorrow night, you're marching with your army as Alexander the Great. Next week, you're the sole survivor of a plane crash in the Amazon jungle. My team and I have created a new channel to tell these tales. The Sleepy Biographer. Same voice, same storytelling you fall asleep to. But instead of learning about these lives, you live them. Link for the Sleepy Biographer is in the description. Tell me if you like it. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're settling into bed, driving home after a long day, or just looking for something to quiet the noise inside your head, you've come to the right place. This is where we slow down. This is where the stories find you. Now, if you're in bed, go ahead and set that phone down. Let it rest somewhere you don't have to think about it. Good. And if you're not in bed yet, that's fine too. Just let your body find whatever position feels like. Not trying. Let your jaw soften. You probably didn't realize you were clenching it. Most people don't. Just let it drop, just a little. And notice how that looseness wants to spread. Down through your neck, into your shoulders. You don't have to make it happen. Just don't prevent it. Now here's what I want you to do. Pick one sound in the room. Any sound. The hum of a fan. The silence itself. My voice. Let that one sound become the only thing that's real for a moment. Everything else, the day you had, the day you've got coming, that thing you keep turning over in your mind, just let it all move to the edges. You don't have to solve any of it tonight. None of it needs you right now. The only thing that needs you right now is this story. All right, let's begin. July 16th, 1945, 5:29 in the morning. The New Mexico desert. A man stands inside a concrete bunker, peering through welder's glass at a tower 20 miles away. Around him, some of the most brilliant physicists in human history are holding their breath. A few are smearing sunscreen on their faces, not for the desert sun, but for what's about to happen. One scientist has made a bet that the device will ignite the entire atmosphere and end all life on Earth. Nobody laughs. The countdown reaches 0, and then the sky splits open. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns turns the pre-dawn darkness into something beyond daylight. Something no human eye has ever seen before. The sand beneath the tower melts into glass. The shockwave rolls across the desert floor like the fist of God, and a mushroom cloud begins to rise 38,000 feet into the air, painting the New Mexico sky in colors that don't have names. In the bunker, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who made all of this possible, watches through the glass. And decades later, sitting in front of an NBC camera in 1965, he would recall that moment with words that have echoed through every generation since. We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another. But here's what most people don't know about that famous quote. Those weren't his words in the moment. Not really. His brother Frank, standing right beside him in the bunker, would later recall that Robert's actual first reaction was much simpler, much more human. He said something like, "I guess it worked." The poetic reflection, the Bhagavad Gita, the destroyer of worlds, came years later, rehearsed and refined for a television camera. In the actual moment of the most dangerous invention in human history, the father of the atomic bomb just stood there. Quiet. Now here's the other thing most people get wrong about that quote. The Sanskrit word in the original Bhagavad Gita, Kala, is most commonly translated by scholars as time, not death. Oppenheimer was reading from Arthur Ryder's 1924 translation, which chose the less common but not entirely incorrect rendering. "I am become death" is more dramatic, it's more cinematic. But most Sanskrit scholars would say the verse actually reads closer to, "I am time grown old, come here to destroy the world." Time, not death. An interesting choice for a man who would spend the rest of his life trying to outrun the consequences of what he'd created. Because what happened to Oppenheimer after the bomb, that's the story most people never hear. How the man who created the most destructive weapon in history became its most vocal opponent. How he begged the government not to build the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful. How the government turned on him, wiretapped his own lawyers, put him through a 27-hour interrogation, and destroyed his career. And how it took 68 years for anyone to admit they were wrong. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers and let the next story find you when you need it most. let me tell you about a boy who was too smart for his own good. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born in 1904 in New York City to a wealthy family. His father was a German immigrant who'd made a fortune in textiles. His mother was a painter. They lived in an apartment on Riverside Drive that held original paintings by Van Gogh and Picasso. By any measure, young Robert had every advantage the world could offer. And he used them all. He was reading at 5. By the time he was 9, he was challenging his older cousin with the words, "Ask me a question in Latin, and I'll answer you in Greek." He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard in 3 years. He earned his PhD at 23. He taught himself Dutch in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, just so he could deliver a lecture on quantum mechanics in the Netherlands. Some people learn a language for a vacation. Oppenheimer learned one to explain the behavior of subatomic particles to an audience of Dutch physicists. But here's what you need to understand about Oppenheimer. He wasn't just brilliant, he was tormented. At Cambridge, as a young postdoctoral student, he was so miserable and so emotionally volatile that he attempted to poison his tutor with an apple, laced with chemicals. The university put him on probation rather than expelling him, perhaps because they recognized they had a generational genius on their hands. And geniuses are given latitude that ordinary mortals are not. This tension between staggering intellectual power and deep emotional fragility would define everything that followed. When the Manhattan Project needed a director, they chose Oppenheimer. Not because he was the most accomplished physicist. He wasn't. He'd never won a Nobel Prize. He'd never run anything larger than a seminar room. But he had something no one else had. The ability to hold the entire project in his mind, to see how all the pieces fit, to talk to the theorists and the engineers and the military brass, and make each group feel understood. General Leslie Groves, the military commander of the project, would later say that Oppenheimer was the only man who could have pulled it off. And he was probably right. Los Alamos, a secret city on a mesa in New Mexico. 2 years of the most intense scientific work in human history. The best minds on Earth, working toward a single goal. Build a weapon so terrible that it would end the war. And possibly, though nobody said this out loud, end all wars forever. That was the dangerous idea. Not just the bomb itself, but the philosophy behind it. Oppenheimer and the physicist Niels Bohr believed in something they never quite named, but that one biographer later called a bizarre and dangerous version of nuclearism. The idea that the bomb was so destructive, so utterly devastating, that no rational nation would ever dare start a war again. Destruction as the path to peace. Death as the guardian of life. It was insane, and it was brilliant, and it was, in a terrible way, partially correct. The Cold War never turned hot, in part because both sides knew what the bombs would do. But on July 16th, 1945, when Trinity turned the desert to glass and the sky caught fire, the philosophical abstraction became reality, and Oppenheimer felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. Within 3 weeks, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Over 200,000 people died. The war ended, and Oppenheimer, the man who'd built the weapon that ended it, looked at what he'd done and felt something he'd never be able to shake. In 1946, Speaking at a university, he said, "We thought of the legend of Prometheus, of that deep sense of guilt in man's new powers." A year later, he was more direct. "The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." Now, you might think the story ends there. Brilliant man builds terrible weapon, feels guilty, becomes a cautionary tale. But that's not what happened. What happened next was far worse. Because Oppenheimer didn't just feel guilty, he acted on it. When the Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, the United States government began pushing for something even more terrifying: the hydrogen bomb. A thermonuclear weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. And Oppenheimer said no. He didn't just say no quietly. He said it loudly, publicly, and with all the intellectual authority he could bring to bear. He argued that the hydrogen bomb was a weapon of genocide, that it had no conceivable military target that wouldn't involve the annihilation of an entire civilian population. He lobbied the government. He wrote reports. He used every ounce of his influence. And this is where it gets truly ugly. Lewis Strauss was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was powerful, ambitious, and nursing a very personal grudge. Years earlier, Oppenheimer had publicly humiliated Strauss during a congressional hearing on the export of radioactive isotopes. The exchange was, by all accounts, devastating. Oppenheimer was witty and dismissive. Strauss never forgot. Now, with Oppenheimer opposing the hydrogen bomb, Strauss saw his chance. He orchestrated a security hearing, not a trial technically, but something that functioned exactly like one. He hired Roger Robb, a prosecutor famous for winning convictions in 23 murder cases, to interrogate Oppenheimer. The hearing lasted 27 grueling hours, but here's the part that should make your blood run cold. The prosecution had access to wiretapped conversations between Oppenheimer and his own defense attorneys. At least 273 intercepted communications were reviewed. Oppenheimer's lawyers were effectively arguing blind. Every strategy they discussed was already known to the other side. The most devastating moment came when Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, once Oppenheimer's colleague, took the stand. Teller said, carefully and deliberately, that he had seen Oppenheimer act in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. It wasn't a direct accusation. It was worse. It was a knife wrapped in academic courtesy. The board voted 2-1 to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. The AEC upheld it 4-1. Richard Rhodes, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning History, wrote, "The hearings broke Oppenheimer's spirit, and he was never the same person afterward. He retreated. He aged visibly." The man who had held the entire Manhattan Project in his mind seemed to shrink. He died of throat cancer in 1967 at 62, and then silence for decades, until 2022. 68 years after the hearing, the United States Department of Energy formally vacated the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. The official statement called the original process a flawed process that violated the Commission's own regulations. 68 years. An entire human lifetime. Now, here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Oppenheimer's dangerous idea wasn't just the bomb. The bomb was the tool. The dangerous idea was this, that the creator has a moral obligation to control what he creates. That building something doesn't give you the right to walk away from its consequences. that power comes with responsibility. And if the people in power won't accept that responsibility, then someone has to stand up and say so, even if it destroys them. Every parent knows this feeling. Every builder, every engineer, every entrepreneur. The thing you created, the business, the family, the technology, the institution. Is it doing what you intended? Or has it become something else entirely? And if it has, what do you do? Oppenheimer tried to put the genie back in the bottle. They destroyed him for it. And it took 68 years for anyone to say he was right. But what happens to a man whose dangerous idea isn't about destroying the world, but about imagining one that's infinite? In the year 1548, in the small town of Nola, near Naples, a boy named Filippo Bruno entered a Dominican monastery. He was 15 years old. He was brilliant, restless, and utterly incapable of keeping his mouth shut. Within a few years, he would take the name Giordano, and within a few decades, that name would become synonymous with one of the most brutal executions in the history of ideas. But first, the idea. Bruno looked up at the stars and saw something that no one else in the 16th century could imagine. He didn't just believe the Earth went around the sun. Copernicus had already suggested that, and it was controversial enough. Bruno went further. He proposed that the universe was infinite, that the stars weren't fixed lights on a crystal sphere, they were distant suns just like ours, and that those distant suns had their own planets orbiting them, and that those planets might harbour life. This was 1584, 440 years before NASA's Kepler mission would confirm the existence of thousands of exoplanets. Bruno saw it. Not through a telescope. Galileo wouldn't build his for another 25 years. Bruno saw it through the power of pure philosophical imagination. And he was right. But that's not why they killed him. See, Bruno didn't stop at cosmology. He denied the Trinity. He denied the divinity of Christ. He questioned the virginity of Mary. He suggested that Jesus was a master magician rather than the Son of God. He rejected eternal damnation. He attacked nearly every foundational doctrine the Catholic Church had built its authority upon. And then, because apparently he hadn't made enough enemies, he spent 20 years wandering Europe as an intellectual fugitive, getting expelled from virtually every community that took him in. Italy, France, England, Germany, wherever he went, his ideas and his abrasive personality would eventually wear out his welcome, and he'd move on. 20 years of running, 20 years of refusing to shut up. The end came because of a nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo. In 1591, Mocenigo invited Bruno back to Italy with promises of patronage and intellectual freedom. Bruno accepted. It was a trap. After a falling out, possibly over money, possibly over Bruno's refusal to teach Mocenigo the art of memory he'd been promised, Mocenigo denounced Bruno to the Venetian Inquisition. Now, here's where it gets dark. The Roman Inquisition demanded custody. Venice reluctantly agreed. Bruno was transferred to Rome, where he was imprisoned for nearly 8 years. 8 years. Think about that. 8 years of interrogation, of theological debates, of pressure to recant. They didn't want to kill him. Burning a former Dominican friar would look terrible. They wanted him to take it back, all of it. Just say you were wrong, apologize, and we'll let you live. Bruno refused. For 8 years. On February 8, 1600, the Inquisitors finally read his death sentence, and this is the moment that has echoed through 4 centuries of intellectual history. Bruno looked at the men who had just condemned him to be burned alive, and he said, in what was described as a menacing tone, words that have been translated in various ways, but the most accepted version, from a letter by the witness Gaspar Shop, reads, "Perhaps your fear in passing judgment on me is greater than mine in receiving it." Let that land for a moment. A man who has just been told he will be burned alive, telling his executioners that they are the frightened ones. 9 days later, on February 17, 1600, Giordano Bruno was led to the Campo de' Fiori in the centre of Rome. He was stripped naked. A metal bridle, a clamp, was fastened over his mouth to prevent him from speaking. They literally silenced him, not metaphorically. They took the one weapon he'd wielded his entire life, his voice, his words, his ideas, and they physically shut it down. He was placed on a mule, because many prisoners could no longer walk after years of confinement. When a crucifix was thrust before his face in a final offer of repentance, Bruno turned his head away. They lit the fire. He burned alive. When it was over, his ashes were gathered and thrown into the Tiber River. Every work he'd ever written was placed on the Church's index of forbidden books. They didn't just want to kill the man, they wanted to kill the idea. Now here's something that'll make you think. The Vatican, centuries later, expressed regret over Bruno's execution, but they never formally apologized. They never exonerated him. When they cleared Galileo in 1992, 359 years late, they specifically did not extend the same courtesy to Bruno. His ideas apparently were still too dangerous. Or perhaps the memory was still too uncomfortable. But the universe didn't care about the Church's opinion. A statue of Giordano Bruno now stands at the exact spot where he was burned alive, in the Campo de' Fiori. An annual memorial service is held there, and every time NASA's test satellite discovers another exoplanet orbiting a distant sun, and there are thousands now, with more found every year, it confirms what a stubborn, brilliant, infuriating monk saw in his mind's eye 440 years ago. The universe is infinite. The stars are distant suns, and those suns have worlds. Bruno was right. He was right about everything, and they burned him anyway. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Bruno's story is often told as science versus religion, and that framing isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Bruno wasn't persecuted purely for his cosmology. His theological heresies, denying the Trinity, questioning Christ's divinity, were just as central to his conviction as his scientific ideas. The Church was in the middle of the Counter-Reformation, fighting Protestant challenges to its authority. A former Dominican friar publicly dismantling core Catholic doctrines was an existential threat on multiple fronts. But that almost makes it worse, doesn't it? Because it means the ideas that got him killed weren't just about the stars. They were about the right to think differently, the right to question, the right to look at the world and say, what if everything we've been told is wrong? That's the most dangerous idea of all. And it's the one that connects every single thinker you'll hear about tonight. Bruno was silenced for imagining a universe beyond what anyone could see. But the next thinker on our list, he could see the truth. He held the evidence in his own hands. He had the numbers, the data, the proof, and they still destroyed him for it. This is, I think, the most heartbreaking story you'll hear tonight. Not the most dramatic, not the most cinematic, the most heartbreaking. Because it's the story of a man who held the simplest truth imaginable. Wash your hands, and watched the world destroy him for saying it. Ignaz Semmelweis was born in 1818 in Budapest, the fifth of 10 children in a prosperous German-speaking family. He studied medicine in Vienna and became an assistant in the obstetric clinic at the Vienna General Hospital. He was young, earnest, and completely unprepared for what he was about to discover. The Vienna General Hospital had 2 maternity clinics. The first clinic was staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. And here's the thing that everyone in Vienna knew, but nobody could explain. The first clinic was a death trap. Women begged to be admitted to the second clinic. They would give birth in the streets rather than enter the first clinic. They knew, through the grapevine, through whispered horror stories, through the desperate knowledge that spreads among people who have no power, that if you went to the first clinic, you might not come out alive. The numbers were staggering. In the first clinic, the maternal mortality rate from childbed fever was over 13%. In some months, it was over 18%. In the second clinic, staffed by midwives, under 2%. Semmelweis became obsessed with this gap. He examined every possible variable. The 2 clinics were in the same building, same ventilation, same temperature, same neighborhood. What was different? And then, in 1847, his friend and colleague Jakob Kolletschka died. Kolletschka had been performing an autopsy when a student accidentally nicked his finger with a scalpel. He developed a fever, his body broke out in abscesses, and he died. The autopsy report on Kolletschka looked identical to the autopsy reports on the women who died of childbed fever. That's when Semmelweis saw it. The medical students in the first clinic went directly from the autopsy room to the maternity ward. They dissected corpses in the morning. Then, without washing their hands, they examined pregnant women in the afternoon. They were carrying something Semmelweis called it cadaverous particles, from the dead to the living. The midwives in the second clinic? They didn't perform autopsies. They never touched a corpse. That was the difference. That was the entire difference. Semmelweis instituted a simple protocol. Before examining any patient, wash your hands in a solution of chlorinated lime. That's it. Wash your hands. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the first clinic, the mortality rate dropped from 18.27% to 1.27%. In March and August of 1848, not a single woman died in his division. Not one. The data was irrefutable. So, here's the question. When you present a medical establishment with evidence that their patients are dying unnecessarily, and you show them a solution that costs virtually nothing and saves thousands of lives, what do you think happens? They thank you, right? They shake your hand and change their practices? They give you a medal? No, they destroy you. The medical establishment rejected Semmelweis, not because the evidence was weak, it was overwhelming. They rejected him because the implication was intolerable. What Semmelweis was really saying, underneath all the data and the chlorinated lime, was this: doctors are killing their own patients. Educated, respected, prestigious doctors are carrying death on their hands. And they don't even know it. That was the dangerous idea, not hand-washing. Hand-washing was the solution. The dangerous idea was that the people we trust the most might be the ones doing the most harm, and the medical establishment could not accept it. Because accepting it meant accepting guilt. It meant admitting that years of practice, decades of training, entire careers had been complicit in the deaths of thousands of women and infants. Some doctors were secretly using Semmelweis's methods, washing their hands in private, while publicly mocking and opposing him. They couldn't admit he was right. Not out loud, not where anyone could hear. Semmelweis, meanwhile, was falling apart. He wrote open letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe, calling them irresponsible murderers and partners in a massacre. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't diplomatic either. And in 19th century medicine, diplomacy mattered more than evidence. He drank, he deteriorated, his behavior became erratic. His wife worried, his colleagues whispered. And then, on July 30th, 1865, a physician named Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra approached Semmelweis with an invitation. Would he like to visit a new medical institute? See the latest facilities, Semmelweis agreed. It wasn't a medical institute. It was the Landesirrenanstalt Döbling, a lunatic asylum. His own colleagues had lured him there under false pretenses. When Semmelweis realized where he was, when he understood what was happening, he tried to leave. The guards beat him. They forced him into a straitjacket. They confined him to a darkened cell. 2 weeks later, on August 13th, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis was dead. He was 47 years old. The cause of death? Pyemia, blood poisoning, sepsis. The man who discovered that hand hygiene prevents sepsis died of sepsis, contracted from wounds inflicted by the very asylum guards who were supposed to be caring for him. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because the irony isn't clever. It isn't literary. It's the kind of irony that makes you want to put down whatever you're holding and just stare at a wall. The universe took the one man who understood how infection spreads and killed him with an infection, in a place he was dragged to by the people who should have been listening to him. It took another 20 years for Louis Pasteur's germ theory to provide the scientific explanation for why hand-washing works. Semmelweis could never explain the mechanism. He just had the data. He knew what was happening, but not why. And without a theory, the establishment had just enough cover to dismiss him. Today, Semmelweis's legacy echoes everywhere. Google honored him with a doodle on March 20th, 2020, specifically to promote hand-washing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the psychological phenomenon he inadvertently discovered, the tendency to reject new evidence that contradicts established beliefs, is now formally named after him. The Semmelweis reflex. You've experienced it, we all have. At work, in families, in politics, in our own heads. Someone presents you with evidence that what you've been doing is wrong, and instead of changing, you attack the messenger. It's one of the deepest and most destructive patterns in human psychology. And it has a name because of a man who washed his hands and paid for it with his life. Now Semmelweis's tragedy was that he could never explain why hand-washing worked. Germ theory hadn't been discovered yet. He had the evidence, but not the framework. But imagine a thinker from 1,000 years before Semmelweis, who also revolutionized medicine, who also insisted on evidence over tradition, and who was punished even more cruelly for it. His name was Abu Bakr Al-Razi. The Western world would come to know him as Razis, and he was, by almost any measure, the greatest physician of the Islamic Golden Age. Now, 9th century Baghdad was not what most people imagine when they think of the medieval world. This was no backward backwater. This was the intellectual centre of the planet, the house of wisdom. Libraries that dwarfed anything in Europe. Scholars translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, while the rest of the world was struggling with basic literacy. Baghdad in the 9th century was, well, imagine Silicon Valley, but with poetry and better food. And at the centre of this extraordinary civilization stood Al-Razi. He was the chief physician at the largest hospital in the Abbasid Caliphate. He wrote over 224 books on medicine, philosophy, alchemy, and dozens of other subjects. He was the first physician in history to distinguish smallpox from measles, a contribution that saved uncountable lives over the centuries that followed. Edward Granville Browne, one of the most respected historians of Islamic medicine, called him probably the greatest and most original of all the Muslim physicians, and one of the most prolific as an author. But here's where Al-Razi's story takes its dangerous turn. His medicine wasn't the problem. His philosophy was. Al-Razi was, to put it plainly, an atheist in 9th century Baghdad. Let that sit for a moment. In a civilization where the political authority of the caliph, the legal system of Sharia, the social fabric of the community, and the very concept of truth itself all derived from divine revelation. Al-Razi stood up and said, "Prophets are either liars or self-deluded. Reason is the only reliable guide to truth. All religions are fraudulent." He didn't whisper this in private. He wrote it down. He published philosophical works arguing that human reason, not revelation, not scripture, not the word of any prophet, was the sole authority on how human beings should live. He criticized not just Islam, but all organized religion. He was, as far as we can tell, one of the most explicitly anti-religious thinkers in the history of the Islamic world. And he did this while serving as the most respected physician in the empire. Now here's what I love about Al-Razi's approach to medicine. It tells you everything about the kind of mind he had. When the caliph commissioned a new hospital in Baghdad, Al-Razi was asked to choose the location. Any other physician would have consulted astrologers, prayed for guidance, or picked somewhere convenient. Al-Razi had a different method. He hung pieces of raw meat at various locations throughout the city. Then he waited. He built the hospital where the meat took the longest to rot. Think about what that means. 1,000 years before germ theory. 1,000 years before Semmelweis. Al-Razi intuited that there was something in the air, something invisible, something environmental, that caused decay and disease. He didn't have a name for it. He didn't have a microscope. He just had observation, logic, and the courage to trust his own reasoning over centuries of tradition. That's evidence-based medicine in the year 900. But his evidence-based approach extended beyond medicine. Al-Razi applied the same ruthless empiricism to philosophy and religion. And this is what made him truly dangerous. Because in his era, questioning the prophet was not an intellectual exercise, it was a death sentence. And Al-Razi knew this. He watched colleagues face persecution for far less. Yet, he continued to write, He continued to argue. He continued to insist that reason, not revelation, was the foundation of human knowledge. The end of his life is told in several versions, and they're all tragic. In the most commonly cited account, a patron, possibly a caliph, possibly a local ruler, ordered Al-Razi beaten on the head with his own books. His own books. The very volumes that contained his life's work, his medical breakthroughs, his philosophical arguments, were used as weapons against him. The blows caused or accelerated the blindness that consumed his final years. In another version, the blindness came from natural causes. Glaucoma, perhaps, worsened by years of alchemical experiments and the fine particles they produced. But even in this gentler telling, the story's end is the same. When his colleagues, physicians who had once been his students, men who owed their careers to his teaching, urged him to undergo surgery to correct his failing vision, the great physician refused. His reported response is one of the most devastating lines in the history of medicine. "I am weary of seeing the world." He died in poverty, not because he had failed, not because his work had been forgotten. He died in poverty because he had given away his wealth. The most famous physician in the Islamic world chose to distribute his fortune to those less fortunate. He died with nothing because he decided nothing was what he needed. Now here's the part of Al-Razi's story that doesn't get told often enough. The authorities could blind him. They could beat him. They could ensure he died with nothing. But they could not destroy his ideas. His medical texts, the Kitab al-Hawi, a comprehensive encyclopedia of medicine, survived the centuries. They were translated into Latin. They were studied in European universities for over 500 years after his death. His distinction between smallpox and measles saved lives long after the men who persecuted him were forgotten dust. His philosophical works were less fortunate. Most were destroyed. We know his anti-religious arguments primarily through the hostile responses of later Muslim scholars who quoted him in order to refute him. They preserved his ideas by accident in their very attempt to bury them. There's a lesson in that. Ideas are resilient. You can burn the books. You can blind the author. You can reduce the thinker to poverty and silence. But the ideas find a way. They survive in the margins, in the footnotes of their enemies, in the DNA of every hospital that hangs fresh meat where the conditions are cleanest. Al-Razi was blinded for his ideas in 9th century Baghdad. But 1,000 years later, in 20th century New York, another brilliant mind would lose something just as precious. Not his sight, but his connection to reality, all because he saw patterns in the universe that nobody else could see. This is a story about what happens when the future arrives too early, when a mind is so far ahead of its time that the world can't keep up, and the mind eventually breaks under the loneliness of it. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856, in the middle of a lightning storm, in a small village in what is now Croatia. According to family legend, the midwife declared the lightning a bad omen. This child would be a child of darkness. His mother immediately corrected her. No, he will be a child of light. She was right, but she couldn't have known the cost. Tesla's childhood was marked by a tragedy that would shadow his entire life. When he was 7 years old, his older brother Daniel was killed in a riding accident. The shock was devastating. young Nikola began seeing vivid flashes of light, blinding visions that would appear without warning, accompanied by detailed hallucinations of objects and scenes that seemed more real than reality itself. These episodes, possibly the earliest signs of the neurological conditions that would intensify throughout his life, terrified him. But they also gave him something extraordinary: the ability to visualize complex machines in perfect, three-dimensional detail, right down to the individual components. He could design an invention entirely in his mind, run it mentally, identify flaws, make corrections, all before drawing a single line on paper. This was his gift, and it was inseparable from his suffering. At 28, Tesla arrived in New York City with 4 cents in his pocket, a letter of recommendation, and a head full of ideas that would change the world. The letter was addressed to Thomas Edison. Tesla went to work for the most famous inventor in America, and almost immediately the two men began to hate each other. The conflict was fundamental. Edison was a DC man, direct current, the technology he'd built his empire on. Tesla had invented something better: alternating current. AC could travel long distances without losing power. DC couldn't. Tesla's system was technically superior in virtually every measurable way. And Edison knew it. What followed became known as the War of the Currents. And it is one of the strangest and most disturbing episodes in the history of technology. Edison, desperate to discredit Tesla's AC system, launched a public campaign of electrocution. He funded public demonstrations where animals, dogs, horses, and eventually an elephant named Topsy in 1903 were killed using alternating current. The message was clear: AC is dangerous. AC kills. Choose DC and you choose safety. Edison even helped design the electric chair to run on alternating current. He wanted Tesla's greatest invention to be forever associated with death. It didn't work. Tesla won. AC became the global standard. It remains the backbone of the world's electrical infrastructure to this day. Every time you plug something into a wall socket, you're using Tesla's technology. In 1893, Tesla had his greatest triumph. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a spectacular World's Fair attended by 27 million people, was lit entirely by Tesla's AC system. It was a technological marvel. The White City, they called it, an entire cityscape blazing with electric light, powered by a system one man had designed inside his mind. Tesla was famous. Tesla was celebrated. Tesla was on top of the world. And then it all fell apart. Tesla's grandest vision was Wardenclyffe Tower, a massive transmission facility on Long Island that would broadcast free wireless energy to the entire world. No wires, no meters, no bills. Energy as free and abundant as sunlight. It was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious ideas in the history of engineering. It was also a direct threat to every power company on Earth. J.P. Morgan, who had been funding the project, pulled his support when he realized Tesla's endgame. Why would Morgan invest in a system that would make his own power infrastructure obsolete? The funding dried up. Wardenclyffe was never completed. The tower was eventually demolished for scrap. And with it went Tesla's connection to the world. The decline was slow and painful. The man who had once dined with the social elite of New York gradually withdrew. His behavior became increasingly eccentric. He developed severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Everything in his life had to be divisible by 3. He required exactly 80 napkins at every meal, arranged in a precise pattern. He could not stay in any hotel room whose number wasn't divisible by 3. He had an overwhelming fear of round objects, an obsession with pigeons, and an inability to touch another person's hair. He moved into room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. 3 times 3 times 3, plus 27, which is 3 cubed, of course. And there, in that room, the man who had lit the 1893 World's Fair and invented the electrical system that powers modern civilization, spent his final years feeding pigeons. Not just any pigeons. There was one pigeon in particular, a white pigeon with light grey tips on her wings. Tesla told friends he loved this pigeon as a man loves a woman. He said that when this pigeon flew to his window, he knew that his life still had purpose. When she stopped coming one night in 1922, and he found her in a park, ill and dying, he said a light went out of his life that never came back. And here's the thing. After that pigeon died, Tesla never produced another significant invention. The last 20 years of his life were spent in increasing isolation, poverty, and obsession. He also claimed to have invented something called the death ray, a particle beam weapon he called teleforce, that could destroy aircraft from hundreds of miles away. He believed this weapon would make war impossible, the same way Oppenheimer later believed the bomb would. Peace through mutually assured destruction. It's an idea that keeps recurring in the minds of brilliant people who build terrible things. On January 7, 1943, a maid at the New Yorker Hotel entered room 3327 and found Nikola Tesla dead. He was 86 years old. He had been alone. He had been surrounded by pigeons. Within hours, FBI agents arrived at the hotel and confiscated his papers. They were particularly interested in the death ray research. The papers were classified. The US government, in the middle of World War II, wasn't taking any chances that Tesla's weapons designs might fall into enemy hands. Months later, the Supreme Court of the United States voided 4 of Marconi's key radio patents and credited Tesla as the true inventor of radio. A lifetime too late. Tesla's dangerous idea wasn't just AC power, or wireless energy, or the death ray. His dangerous idea was that everything should be free. Energy, information, communication. He envisioned a world where technology served humanity rather than corporations. Where invention was driven by wonder, not profit. Where the patterns he saw in the universe, the mathematical elegance of frequency and resonance and electromagnetic fields, could liberate human beings from scarcity. The world wasn't ready, and it broke him. Today, the SI unit of magnetic flux density is called the Tesla. Elon Musk named his electric car company after him. He's become a symbol of the visionary genius who was too far ahead of his time. But the real Tesla, the man who loved a pigeon, who counted to 3, who died alone in a hotel room while the government raided his belongings, that Tesla is sadder and stranger and more human than any symbol. Tesla died alone because the world couldn't keep up with his vision. But 2,400 years earlier, there was a philosopher who was alone on purpose. He chose it. He lived in a ceramic jar. He mocked the most powerful man on earth to his face. And he became the most dangerous comedian in the history of philosophy. All right, I need to tell you about Diogenes. And I need to warn you, this one's different. every other story tonight is about suffering, torture, execution, madness, exile. This one is about a man who found a way to be completely free. And he did it by being the most outrageous human being who ever lived. Diogenes of Sinope was born around 413 BC in what is now Turkey. His father was a wealthy banker. They had money, they had status, they had everything the ancient Greek world considered necessary for a good life. And then it all vanished. Diogenes' family was caught debasing the city's coinage, literally shaving metal off the coins to pocket the difference. They were exposed, publicly disgraced, and exiled. In ancient Greece, exile wasn't just inconvenient, it was considered a fate worse than death. You lost your citizenship, your property, your identity, your right to exist as a member of civilized society. Most people would have been destroyed by this. Diogenes was liberated. Here's the thing about Diogenes. The moment everything was taken from him, he had what Plutarch called a moment of philosophical conversion. He looked at what had happened, his family destroyed by the pursuit of wealth, his life shattered by the conventions of society, and he drew the most radical conclusion in the history of philosophy. If society can take everything from you, then nothing society offers is truly yours. Money, an illusion, status, a prison, reputation, a leash. The only path to real freedom is to need nothing, want nothing, fear nothing. And so he walked into Athens. He dismissed his one remaining slave, and he began to live in a pithos, a large ceramic storage jar used for storing grain and wine. Not a barrel, by the way. Barrels didn't exist in ancient Greece. That mistranslation came from Seneca, writing 500 years later. But the man who lived in a barrel sounds better than the man who lived in a ceramic jar, so the barrel stuck. Now, what Diogenes did next is either deeply philosophical or completely insane, possibly both. He begged for food, he wore rags, he urinated in public, he defecated in the theatre. He did other things in public that I'll describe delicately by saying he believed that if an act is not shameful in private, performing it in public cannot make it shameful. When challenged about this particular habit in the marketplace, he said, if only it were so easy to soothe hunger by rubbing an empty belly. He was, in every sense of the word, a troll, the world's first troll. 2,400 years before the internet, Diogenes of Sinope invented trolling. But here's what separates Diogenes from a mere provocateur. Behind every outrageous act was a philosophical argument. He wasn't being crude for the sake of being crude. He was systematically attacking every convention that held Greek society together: property, hierarchy, religious ritual, political authority, sexual norms, family structure, and demonstrating through his own body and his own life that none of them were necessary for human happiness. In fact, he argued, they were the obstacles to happiness. Civilization didn't free people, it enslaved them. Plato called him Socrates gone mad. And I think Plato meant it as an insult, but Diogenes would have taken it as the highest compliment imaginable. Speaking of Plato, here's one of my favorite stories in all of philosophy. Plato had given a lecture at his academy in which he defined a human being as a featherless biped. Quite elegant, really. 2 legs, no feathers, that's what separates humans from other animals. The students were impressed. The next day, Diogenes showed up at the academy gates. carrying a plucked chicken. He held it up and announced, "Behold, I have brought you a man." Plato was reportedly so flustered that he had to revise his definition. He added the qualifier "with broad nails." A featherless biped with broad nails. Philosophy was never quite the same. But the most famous moment in Diogenes' life, and arguably the most famous anecdote in all of Western philosophy, came when he met the most powerful man on earth. Alexander the Great was visiting Corinth. He was young, brilliant, and conquering the known world. He had heard of Diogenes. Everyone had heard of Diogenes, and he wanted to meet the legendary philosopher. So Alexander, surrounded by his generals and courtiers, went to find the old man. He found Diogenes sunbathing by the side of the road. Alexander stood over him, casting a shadow across the philosopher's face, and declared something like, "I am Alexander the Great. Ask me for anything you want, and it shall be yours." Imagine this, the most powerful man in the Western world, offering you anything. Gold, land, an army, a kingdom, name it. Diogenes looked up at him and said, "Yes, stand a little out of my sunshine." That's it. That was all he wanted. The most powerful man on earth was blocking his light, and he wanted him to move. Alexander's companions were furious. This was an insult to the king. But Alexander himself was stunned. He turned to his generals and said words that have survived 2,400 years. "If I were not Alexander, I should wish to be Diogenes." Now think about what just happened there. Alexander had everything: power, wealth, fame, and empire stretching from Greece to India. Diogenes had nothing: no home, no money, no possessions beyond a wooden bowl, which he later discarded when he saw a child drinking water with cupped hands, declaring, "A child has beaten me in simplicity of living." And yet it was Alexander who envied Diogenes, not the other way around. The man with everything looked at the man with nothing, and saw something he would never possess: freedom from wanting. That's the dangerous idea. Not that poverty is noble, or that civilization is bad. The dangerous idea is that everything we spend our lives pursuing, money, status, comfort, security, approval, might be the very things that keep us trapped. That the prison isn't out there. The prison is the wanting itself. There's one more story I want to tell you about Diogenes, and it's the one that I think about late at night. At some point in his life, Diogenes was captured by pirates. They sailed him to Crete and put him on the auction block to be sold as a slave. The auctioneer asked him what skills he possessed. Diogenes replied, "That of governing men." He then pointed to a well-dressed Corinthian man in the crowd and said, "Sell me to that man. He needs a master." He was sold to the man, a man named Xeniades, and became the tutor of Xeniades' children. By all accounts, he was an excellent teacher. The man who was sold as property ended up running the household. The slave became the master. He died around 323 BC, reportedly on the same day as Alexander the Great. Whether that's true or merely poetic coincidence is impossible to know. But there's something fitting about it. The man who had everything and the man who had nothing leaving the world on the same day. Diogenes also coined a word we still use. When asked where he was from, he replied, "I'm a citizen of the world." The Greek word, cosmopolites, was the first recorded use of the term cosmopolitan. A homeless, penniless philosopher in a ceramic jar invented the concept of global citizenship. Now Diogenes stripped away everything: possessions, reputation, dignity, even basic social behavior, to find freedom. He proved you could be happy with nothing. But what happens when you strip away not your belongings, but your very control? When you hand complete strangers a loaded gun and say, "Do whatever you want." I want you to picture something. You're standing in a small art gallery in Naples. It's December of 1974. It's 8 o'clock at night. In the center of the room stands a woman, 28 years old, Serbian, slim, dark-haired, and completely still. She's standing behind a long table, and on that table are 72 objects. Some of the objects are pleasant: a rose, a feather, honey, grapes, wine, a glass of water, an olive branch, perfume, a cake. Some of the objects are not: scissors, a scalpel, nails, a metal bar, razor blades, a knife, chains. And at the far end of the table, loaded and ready to fire, a gun, with one bullet beside it. Next to the table is a small sign with typed instructions. They read, "I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility. There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired." The woman's name is Marina Abramovic. The performance is called Rhythm Zero. And what happened over the next 6 hours would become one of the most disturbing and illuminating experiments in the history of art, and possibly in the history of human psychology. At first, nothing much happened. People approached cautiously. Someone offered her the rose. Someone fed her the cake. Someone dipped a finger in the honey and touched it to her lips. It was gentle, tentative, almost sweet. But you know where this is going, don't you? Because you know people. As the minutes became hours, the mood began to shift. Someone used the scissors to cut a piece of her clothing. Someone else cut another piece. The cuts became larger, more aggressive. By hour 2, her clothes were being systematically removed. By hour 3, she was standing almost naked in front of a room full of strangers. And then it got worse. Someone took the razor blade and made a small cut on her neck. Someone else sucked the blood from the wound. Minor sexual assaults were carried out on her body. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood there, perfectly still, exactly as she had promised. The audience split into 2 factions. One group was escalating, pushing the boundaries further and further, testing how far they could go with a human being who had voluntarily surrendered all her autonomy. The other group tried to protect her. They wiped her tears. They stood between her and the aggressors. A small war broke out in a gallery in Naples over the body of a woman who had decided to become an object. And then came the gun. Someone picked it up, loaded it, placed it in Abramovic's hand, and slowly, deliberately worked her finger around the trigger, pressing the barrel against her own head. Let that sit for a moment. A room full of ordinary people, gallery visitors, art enthusiasts, regular citizens of Naples on a Wednesday evening had escalated from feeding a woman cake to pressing a loaded gun against her skull. In 3 hours, a fight broke out. Someone grabbed the gun away. Others shouted. The tension in the room was, by all accounts, almost unbearable. But Abramovic didn't move. She had made a promise. 6 hours as an object. And she would see it through. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the 6 hours ended. Abramovic straightened up. She looked around the room, and then she did the simplest, most devastating thing imaginable. She started walking toward the audience. That's all. She just walked toward them. A human being, looking them in the eye. No longer an object, a person. And every single person in that room ran. They fled. The people who had cut her skin, stripped her clothes, sucked her blood, and pressed a loaded gun to her head. They could not face a human being who was looking back at them. The moment she was a person again, they couldn't bear it. They literally ran out of the gallery rather than confront what they had done. What I learned, Abramovic said later, in one of the most chilling sentences in the history of art, was that if you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you. Now, I need you to understand something about this performance. Abramovic was not making a theoretical argument about human nature. She wasn't writing a philosophy paper. She wasn't conducting a study with control groups and statistical analysis. She was using her own body, her own skin, her own blood, her own life, as the experimental apparatus. And the results were unambiguous. Give people unchecked power over another person. Remove the consequences and watch what happens. The answer is, they will destroy you. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough of them quickly enough to prove a point that most philosophers only ever discuss in the abstract. This was 1974. 5 years before, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment had shown something similar, that ordinary college students, given authority over other students, would descend into cruelty within days. A decade before that, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments had demonstrated that most people will administer what they believe are lethal electric shocks to another human being if an authority figure tells them to. But Abramovic didn't need institutional authority. She didn't need a professor in a lab coat giving instructions. She didn't need uniforms or roles or assigned power dynamics. All she needed was a table full of objects, a statement of consent, and 6 hours. The results were the same, possibly worse. Think about what this means for everything. Every workplace where one person has power over another. Every relationship where one partner controls the other. Every comment section where anonymity removes accountability. Every system, political, corporate, social, familial, where checks and balances are the only thing standing between order and cruelty. Abramovic didn't just create art that night in Naples. She empirically proved one of the oldest and most uncomfortable truths about human beings. We are exactly as good as our consequences force us to be. Remove the consequences, and the veneer of civilization is thinner than you'd like to believe. She grew up under Tito's communist dictatorship in Yugoslavia. Both her parents were partisan war heroes in World War II. Her childhood was defined by authoritarian control, by the knowledge that power, when unchecked, devours everything in its path. Rhythm Zero wasn't just a performance, it was a testimony. Abramovic proved that when you give people power without consequences, they'll destroy you. But 500 years earlier, a man wrote the definitive manual on how to use that power, from a prison cell, while his shoulders were still dislocated from torture. Niccolo Machiavelli had spent 14 years of his life serving the Florentine Republic. 14 years of diplomatic missions, military negotiations, intelligence gathering, and political strategy. He was the second chancellor, not a title that sounds glamorous, but a position that put him at the centre of some of the most complex and dangerous politics in Renaissance Italy. He was good at his job, very good. He'd met with kings and popes. He'd travelled to France and Germany on behalf of the Republic. He'd watched firsthand as Cesare Borgia, the most feared man in Italy, lured his enemies to the town of Senigallia with promises of friendship and gifts, and then had every single one of them murdered. Machiavelli was in the room. He saw it happen, and he took notes. Then, in 1512, everything collapsed. The Medici family returned to power in Florence, backed by Spanish troops and the authority of the Pope. The republic Machiavelli had served was overthrown, and he, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the Florentine state, was immediately dismissed from office. It gets worse. Shortly after the Medici takeover, a list of suspected conspirators was discovered. Machiavelli's name was on it. He almost certainly had nothing to do with the conspiracy. But it didn't matter. A town crier read his arrest warrant in 50 different locations across Florence. A bounty of 12 florins was placed on his head. Rather than run, Machiavelli went voluntarily to the authorities, likely to protect friends and family who might be punished if he fled. He was taken to the Bargello, Florence's feared prison, and subjected to a form of torture called the Strappado, specifically the brutal variant known as squassation. Here's how it worked. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back. A rope was attached to his wrists. He was hoisted high into the air by that rope. Arms twisted backward, shoulders straining against their sockets. Then he was dropped. The rope jerked taut, catching his full body weight on the bound wrists. The shoulders dislocated, the arms wrenched nearly out of their sockets. The pain was, by all accounts, excruciating. They did this to Machiavelli 6 times, 6 drops. Both shoulders dislocated, arms damaged so severely the effects may have lasted the rest of his life. And here's the part that tells you everything about the man. While still in his prison cell, still recovering from 6 drops on the Strappado, Machiavelli wrote sonnets, jokes, amusing poems about his own torture. He wrote a verse in which he compared his situation to that of other famous prisoners and found humour in the comparison. The man whose shoulders had just been ripped apart was writing comedy. He never confessed. He never named names. He never admitted anything. After 3 weeks, he was released, partly because a new Medici Pope had been elected and a general amnesty was declared. But freedom didn't mean restoration. Machiavelli was banned from Florence, exiled to his family's small farm in the countryside. Banned from the city he loved, banned from the work that had defined him, injured, unemployed, and forgotten. What did Machiavelli do with his exile? Well, during the day he chased thrushes. He played backgammon at the local inn with the butcher, the miller, and the kiln worker. He argued about nothing. He rotted, as he put it in a letter to a friend, in obscurity and neglect. But then, in the evenings, something extraordinary happened. Machiavelli would return to his study. He would change out of his mud-stained country clothes and put on what he called his regal and courtly garments. He would sit at his desk, and he would enter, as he wrote, the ancient courts of ancient men, communing through his books with the great political thinkers of history. He would lose himself in the writings of Tacitus, Livy, Plutarch. And out of that communion, out of those long, lonely evenings in exile, he wrote the most influential political treatise in the history of Western civilization. The Prince. Now, here's the thing about The Prince that most people don't know. It wasn't a philosophical meditation written for posterity. It was a job application. Machiavelli dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of the very family that had exiled him. The entire book was, in essence, a demonstration of his political knowledge, designed to convince the Medici that he was too useful to leave rotting on a farm. Lorenzo didn't care. He reportedly never read it. One story holds that when the book was presented to the young ruler, he was more interested in a gift of hunting dogs from another visitor. The most dangerous book in the history of political thought was less interesting to its intended audience than a pair of greyhounds. Machiavelli spent the rest of his life hoping for a recall to service that never came. He died in 1527 at 58, still essentially in exile. The Prince was published 5 years after his death. And then it changed everything. The Catholic Church immediately banned it. Some Enlightenment thinkers, Diderot among them, later speculated that the book was actually satire, designed to expose the corruption of princes rather than teach it. His name became an adjective, Machiavellian, synonymous with cunning, manipulation, and a moral political strategy. But here's what's actually dangerous about Machiavelli. It's not that he taught rulers to be evil. It's that he was the first major thinker to describe politics as it actually works, rather than how moral philosophers said it should work. He looked at the gap between ideals and reality, between what leaders preach and what leaders practice, and he said, "Stop pretending. This is how power works. If you want to survive, you need to learn how not to be good." That's the dangerous idea. Not evil itself, but honesty about evil. The recognition that the rules we're taught, be kind, be fair, be honest, sometimes don't apply when you're responsible for the survival of a state, a family, an institution. That there are moments when doing the right thing and doing the necessary thing are not the same. Every person over 40 has had this realization. You've had it at work when you watched someone succeed through manipulation while honesty got you nowhere. You've had it in relationships when the kind truth would have been kinder than the comfortable lie. You've had it staring at the news, wondering why the world doesn't work the way you were told it would. Machiavelli was the first person to write that down and say it out loud, and they've been calling him evil for 500 years because of it. His tomb, by the way, is in the church of Santa Croce in Florence, the very church he was banned from entering during the last years of his life. Machiavelli exposed the ugly truth about power. But what about the truth about knowledge itself? What happens when a woman becomes the most brilliant mind in an entire city, and the city destroys her for it? And what happens when, centuries later, the words we put in her mouth were never hers to begin with? Let me tell you about a woman you think you know. You've probably seen her quotes on social media. Reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. Beautiful, isn't it? Inspiring, the kind of thing you'd put on a poster. She never said it. Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myths, and miracles as poetic fancies. Powerful stuff. Rational, defiant. She never said that, either. Not a single famous quote attributed to Hypatia of Alexandria, the woman who is held up as history's first great female mathematician, as a martyr for reason, as a symbol of everything that was lost when the ancient world crumbled, was actually spoken by her. Not one. Every single Hypatia quote you've ever seen on the internet was invented in 1908 by a man named Elbert Hubbard, a soap salesman from Illinois who wrote popular biographies of historical figures and apparently felt no compunction about putting words in the mouths of the dead. Now, that is a story. But let me tell you the real one first, because the real story of Hypatia is more disturbing, more complicated, and ultimately more important than the sanitized version most people know. Hypatia was born sometime around 350 to 370 AD in Alexandria, Egypt, one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Her father was Theon, the last known member of the Alexandrian Museum, the institution linked to the legendary Library of Alexandria. He raised his daughter with an education that was extraordinary for anyone of that era, let alone a woman. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, literature, swimming, horseback riding, even mountain climbing. She surpassed him. In mathematics, she surpassed her own father. She edited and commented on the great works of classical mathematics and astronomy. She may have edited the surviving text of Ptolemy's Almagest, one of the most important astronomical texts in history. She is believed to have invented or improved the astrolabe, a device for measuring the positions of stars, and the hydrometer, an instrument for measuring the density of liquids. But what made Hypatia truly remarkable and truly dangerous was not just her intellect. It was her visibility. She taught publicly. She wore the philosopher's cloak, the tribon, something virtually unheard of for a woman. She walked through the streets of Alexandria, lecturing on Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists. She drew students from across the Mediterranean. She became an advisor to the Roman prefect Orestes, the highest political authority in the city. And here's the detail that complicates the narrative most people tell about Hypatia. Every single one of her known students was Christian. Not pagan, Christian. The woman who is often portrayed as a martyr of paganism destroyed by Christian fanaticism was, in fact, beloved by her Christian students. Christian bishops counted themselves among her circle. The letters of her student Synesius of Cyrene, who became a Christian bishop, show deep affection and respect. So what happened? Alexandria was tearing itself apart. The new Christian patriarch Cyril was aggressively consolidating power. He attacked pagans. He expelled Jews from the city. He was engaged in a bitter power struggle with the Roman prefect Orestes. And Hypatia's friendship with Orestes made her a target. Not because she was pagan exactly, but because she was influential. She had the ear of the political authority, and she represented an intellectual tradition that existed outside of Cyril's control. Cyril, or those loyal to him, the historical record is somewhat ambiguous, mounted what we would today call a smear campaign. Hypatia was accused of practicing black magic. She was called a dangerous witch, who used satanic enchantments to draw people to her lectures. In an era of rising superstition and religious fanaticism, these accusations were effectively a death warrant. In March of 415 AD, during the Christian season of Lent, a mob led by a church reader named Peter ambushed Hypatia's chariot on the streets of Alexandria. They dragged her into the Caesareum, a building that had once been a pagan temple, now converted into a church. They stripped her naked. They scraped the skin from her body with oyster shells, or broken tiles, the sources vary. She died from the wounds. They then dismembered her corpse and burned it. She was somewhere between 45 and 65 years old. We don't know her exact age because we don't know her exact birth year. The historical record for women is always thinner. Her murder sent shockwaves through the Roman Empire. For centuries, philosophers had been considered effectively untouchable during public violence. The killing of a woman philosopher by a mob was seen as, in the words of one scholar, profoundly dangerous and destabilizing. It marked a turning point, the moment when the ancient tradition of philosophical inquiry, which had existed in one form or another for nearly 1,000 years, was extinguished in Alexandria. And then silence. Centuries of silence. None of Hypatia's writings survived. Not her mathematical commentaries, not her astronomical work, not a single sentence written in her own hand. Everything we know about her comes from other people, her students' letters, later historical accounts, fragments and references. Her voice was erased so completely that when 14 centuries later a man wanted to make her inspirational, he had to invent her words from scratch. That man was Elbert Hubbard, a charismatic American writer, publisher, and soap salesman, yes, soap, who in 1908 published a series called Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great Teachers. His entry on Hypatia was florid, romantic, and packed with quotations that had no historical basis whatsoever. Hubbard simply wrote them himself, in a style he thought sounded suitably ancient and wise, and attributed them to Hypatia. And the Internet, which does not check sources, spread them everywhere. Today, if you search for Hypatia quotes, nearly every result leads back to Hubbard's 1908 fabrications. The most famous words attributed to history's first great female mathematician were written by a man who sold soap. Now, there's something deeply uncomfortable about this. We, meaning well-intentioned people who admire Hypatia and want to honor her legacy, have been honoring her with words she never spoke. We have, in a way, done what the mob did. We've replaced the real woman with something more convenient. The mob replaced her with silence. We replaced her with a character in a story we wanted to tell about reason versus faith, feminism versus patriarchy, science versus religion. The real Hypatia was more complicated. She was a pagan teacher beloved by Christian students. She was murdered not for her paganism per se, but because she was entangled in a political conflict between church and state. Her actual intellectual contributions, her mathematical work, her astronomical instruments, her edited texts, have been largely forgotten in favor of her martyrdom. The lesson isn't simple, it's layered. How do we remember the people history has silenced without silencing them again in a different way? How much of what we know about historical figures was projected onto them by later generations? And what does it say about us that we needed a soap salesman to give voice to a mathematician? We invented words for Hypatia that she never spoke, but the next thinker on our list, his own community tried to make sure nobody would ever speak his words again. They cursed him by day and by night, in sleeping and in waking. And 370 years later, they still haven't forgiven him. On July 27, 1656, in the synagogue of the Talmud Torah congregation in Amsterdam, a 23-year-old man stood before his entire community and heard the following words read aloud. The lords of the Muhammad, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, have endeavoured by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. We order that no one should communicate with him, neither in writing, nor accord him any favour, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor come within 4 cubits of his vicinity. The text went on. It cursed him by day and by night, in sleeping and in waking, in going out and in coming in. It invoked every malediction in the book of the law. It was, by the consensus of scholars, the most severe excommunication in the history of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community, possibly the most severe in the history of European Jewry. And it has never been lifted. 370 years. Multiple campaigns have tried to get the excommunication reversed. The community's chief rabbi has consistently declined, stating that the ban remains in force for all time and cannot be rescinded. Spinoza's ideas apparently are still too dangerous. So what, exactly, did this 23-year-old say that was so threatening? Baruch de Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam to a family of Portuguese Jewish refugees. His family had fled the Inquisition, the same institution that burned Giordano Bruno. They had endured generations of forced conversion, secret worship, and the ever-present threat of torture and death for their faith. Amsterdam was their refuge. The Jewish community there had finally found safety, finally found a place where they could worship openly, raise their children, build businesses and institutions. They were desperate to prove themselves as loyal, orderly, productive citizens. And into this community, fragile, traumatized, fiercely protective of its hard-won place in Dutch society, was born a boy with one of the most dangerous minds in the history of human thought. Spinoza was brilliant from the start. He studied Hebrew, the Talmud, Jewish philosophy. He was being groomed to be a rabbi. But he also read broadly Descartes, the new science, the forbidden philosophers. And somewhere in his studies, he began to see something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He began to believe that God, the personal, intervening, prayer-answering God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, did not exist. Not that God didn't exist at all. Spinoza wasn't a simple atheist. His idea was far more radical than that. He proposed that God and nature are one and the same thing, that there is no personal deity separate from the universe, that God is simply another word for the total, infinite, self-sustaining system of everything that exists. No creator standing outside creation. No divine being who rewards the good and punishes the wicked. No miracles, no afterlife, no chosen people. And, perhaps most devastatingly, no free will. Spinoza argued that human beings are entirely determined by causes and conditions. The sense that we freely choose our actions is, in his analysis, an illusion created by our ignorance of the forces acting upon us. Now, the Amsterdam community tried to handle this quietly. Before the excommunication, community leaders reportedly attempted to bribe him. They offered Spinoza a generous annual allowance, essentially a pension for life, if he would just keep his mouth shut and show up at synagogue occasionally. Just be quiet, take the money, pretend to believe. How hard can it be? Spinoza refused. Think about what that means. He was 23. He was being offered financial security for life. All he had to do was stay silent, and he said no, not because he was a crusader, not because he wanted to be a martyr, but because he believed, with the absolute implacable conviction that defined his entire life, that truth cannot be bartered. That intellectual honesty is not for sale. After the excommunication, Spinoza moved to the outskirts of Amsterdam, then to various small towns in the Netherlands. He made his living doing something no one would expect of one of history's greatest philosophers. He ground optical lenses, glass, day after day, hour after hour, carefully, precisely grinding glass into the curved shapes needed for microscopes and telescopes. The irony is almost too perfect. The man whose ideas would focus the lens of modern philosophy spent his days literally making lenses. He lived simply. He declined offers of prestigious university positions because they came with restrictions on what he could teach. He published his most dangerous work, the theological political treatise, anonymously, with a false publisher and a fictional place of publication. And when that didn't protect him, when his identity was discovered, and the book was immediately banned by both Catholic and Protestant authorities, he simply continued working. His masterwork, The Ethics, was so dangerous that he never published it during his lifetime. It was circulated only after his death in 1677. He died at 44, likely from a lung disease caused by inhaling glass dust while grinding lenses. The greatest philosopher of his era was killed by his day job. Now, here's what stays with me about Spinoza. It isn't the intellectual grandeur of his system, though it is grand. It's the quietness of his courage. He didn't rage like Semmelweis. He didn't wander like Bruno. He didn't provoke like Diogenes. He simply chose. He chose truth over comfort. He chose poverty over a comfortable lie. He chose a life of grinding lenses over a pension for silence. And centuries later, when Albert Einstein was asked if he believed in God, he answered, "I believe in Spinoza's God." The God who is nature. The God who doesn't answer prayers or perform miracles. The God who is the mathematical structure of reality itself. Spinoza chose a quiet life of grinding lenses and thinking forbidden thoughts. But the next thinker? His confinement wasn't chosen. It was forced. And in the darkest cell in France, by candlelight, he created something that would survive for 200 years, and eventually be declared a national treasure by the very nation that had sentenced him to death. The Marquis de Sade spent approximately 32 of his 74 years in prison or in asylums, nearly half his life, locked behind what he described as 19 iron doors. And from behind those doors he wrote, and wrote, and wrote, obsessively, relentlessly, as if the words themselves could batter down the walls. Most of what he wrote was destroyed, deliberately by authorities who found his work so dangerous they couldn't allow it to exist. Over 3/4 of his literary output was burned, confiscated, or lost. But one work survived, and the story of its survival is one of the most extraordinary odysseys in the history of literature. Donatien Alphonse François, Marquis de Sade, was born in 1740 to one of the oldest noble families in France. He served as a colonel of dragoons in the 7 Years' War. He married well. He had everything a man of his station could want. And then he began pursuing sexual violence with a compulsion that even his permissive era could not tolerate. He was arrested, released, arrested again. He fled to Italy. He was sentenced to death in absentia. By effigy, his image was burned in a public square. He was eventually captured and locked in the fortress of Vincennes, then transferred to the Bastille. Now, I want to be careful here. Sade's crimes were real. His victims were real. He is not a sympathetic figure in the conventional sense. And his philosophy, that nature is immoral, that morality is merely a social construct, that true freedom requires confronting the darkest aspects of human desire, was designed to shock. He wanted to force his readers to look at the parts of human nature that polite society pretends don't exist. But what happened in the Bastille, that transcends biography. In the autumn of 1785, imprisoned in his cell, Sade began what would become one of the most remarkable feats of literary creation in history. For 37 consecutive evenings, working only by candlelight during the few hours between his evening meal and bed, he wrote on tiny strips of parchment in handwriting so small it required a magnifying glass to read. As each strip filled, he pasted the next one below, creating a continuous scroll. After 37 nights, the scroll measured 39 feet long. 12 meters of parchment covered in 157,000 words. A complete novel. The 120 Days of Sodom, written in conditions that would drive most people to silence, not creation. He hid it between bricks in his cell wall. Then, in July 1789, days before the most important event in French history, Sade made a crucial mistake. He began shouting from his cell window to the crowds below, telling them that the guards were murdering inmates. Whether this was true is unclear. What is clear is that the authorities decided he was too much trouble to keep in the Bastille. On July the 4th, 1789, he was transferred to the Charenton Asylum, naked as a worm, according to one account, with no time to collect his belongings. 10 days later, on July 14th, 1789, the Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution had begun, and Sade's cell, with the scroll still hidden between the bricks, was in the hands of the revolutionaries. Sade believed the scroll was destroyed. He later wrote that he wept tears of blood over its loss. He was wrong. A young revolutionary named Arnoux de Saint-Maximin discovered the scroll and removed it. And from that moment, the manuscript began one of the most bizarre journeys in literary history. It passed through aristocratic families. It was sold, resold, stolen, smuggled. It crossed national borders. It was hidden, lost, found again. In the 20th century, it was purchased by a French investment firm called Aristophil for 7 million euros. And then the firm's founder was arrested for running a Ponzi scheme, potentially embezzling up to 850 million euros. The scroll, caught up in the legal wreckage, became state evidence. In December of 2017, France declared the manuscript a national treasure, a designation that prevented it from being sold abroad. Then, in July of 2021, France formally acquired the scroll for 4.55 million euros. Think about what happened there. The same nation that once sentenced the Marquis de Sade to death by burning in effigy declared his most extreme work a national treasure. The same country that locked him behind 19 iron doors paid millions to protect what he wrote in the dark. And the word sadism, derived from his name, entered into every major language on earth, is the only word in English named after a French nobleman. His name didn't just survive his imprisonment, it became part of the language itself. Now, I want to be clear about what makes Sade's story a dangerous idea in the context of tonight's journey. It's not the content of his work, which is deliberately extreme and designed to provoke. It's the act of creation itself. The dangerous idea here is that the human need to express, to create, to put words on a surface and leave a mark on the world is indestructible. You can lock a man behind 19 iron doors. You can take away his freedom, his family, his dignity, his name. You can confiscate his manuscripts and burn them. And he will write on scraps of parchment by candlelight, in letters too small for the naked eye, and hide his work between bricks. Because the need to create is not a luxury. It is a survival mechanism. It is perhaps the most fundamental expression of what it means to be human. Sade proved that in the darkest cell in France, with the most minimal tools imaginable, a human being will still create. De Sade created his masterwork in a prison cell. Writing by candlelight on a scroll, he hid between bricks. But the next thinker deliberately imprisoned himself, not in a cell of stone, but in the depths of his own unconscious mind. He dove into madness on purpose, and what he brought back would change psychology forever. In 1906, a young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung sent a copy of his research on word association tests to the most famous psychologist in the world, Sigmund Freud. Freud responded with enthusiastic interest. The two men began a correspondence that quickly became the most important intellectual relationship of either man's life. When they finally met in person in Vienna in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight. 13 hours. Without stopping. It was, by all accounts, a meeting of minds so intense and so profound that both men were shaken by it. Freud saw in Jung his intellectual heir, the man who would carry psychoanalysis into the future. Jung saw in Freud the father figure he'd always craved. But here's the thing about intellectual love affairs. They end badly. Over the following years, deep disagreements festered. Jung believed Freud was too fixated on sexuality as the root of all psychological experience. He thought Freud's model of the unconscious didn't go deep enough. That beneath the personal unconscious, filled with repressed memories and desires, lay something much vaster, much older. A collective unconscious shared by all of humanity, filled with ancient patterns Freud couldn't see. When Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, laying out these ideas in full, Freud was furious. He saw it as a betrayal. The relationship fractured. Freud ended it with a letter in which he stated he would lose nothing by abandoning their friendship. Colleagues who had respected Jung were forced to choose sides. Almost all of them chose Freud. Jung was alone. And then the visions began. In late 1913, Jung started experiencing what he would later describe as an incessant stream of fantasies. He saw rivers of blood flooding across Europe. He saw the Alps grow higher and higher, as if trying to protect Switzerland from the deluge. He saw entire cities drowned in gore. The visions were so vivid, so overpowering, that he worried he was losing his mind. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible, he wrote later. I was living in a constant state of tension. I had to cling to the table so as not to fall apart. He privately feared he was doing a schizophrenia. Then, in August of 1914, World War I erupted, and Jung realized his visions hadn't been psychosis. They had been precognition. The rivers of blood were real. Europe was drowning. Something in his unconscious mind had sensed the catastrophe before it arrived. This realization changed everything. If the unconscious could produce such devastating accuracy, what else was down there? What other truths were hiding in the darkness beneath conscious thought? And so Jung made a decision that is, I think, one of the bravest decisions any human being has ever made. He decided to go in. Rather than fight the visions, rather than medicate them away or wall them off with rationality, he deliberately opened the door to his own unconscious and walked through it. Every evening, after maintaining his psychiatric practice during the day, seeing patients, treating them, functioning as a competent professional, he would sit down, enter a state of deep relaxation, and deliberately invite the visions to come. He called the technique active imagination. It was like controlled dreaming. He would descend into the imagery, interact with the figures he found there, argue with them, ask them questions, and then meticulously record everything that happened. One night, a female voice spoke to him. It said, "That is art." Jung argued back, emphatically. What he was doing, he insisted, was not art. It was psychological investigation. The voice belonged to what he would later identify as the anima, the feminine aspect of the male unconscious, and the fact that he argued with a voice in his own head, rather than simply accepting what it said, tells you everything about the kind of mind he had. Even inside his own unconscious, Carl Jung was disagreeing with the furniture. Over the next 16 years, from 1913 to roughly 1930, Jung transcribed his visions into what would become one of the most extraordinary objects in the history of psychology. He called it Liber Novus. The world would come to know it as the Red Book. It is a massive, hand-illuminated folio, 12 by 15.5 inches, nearly 10 pounds. Over 400 pages of calligraphic text in Jung's own hand, accompanied by 53 paintings of astonishing beauty and disturbing power. The visual style resembles nothing so much as a medieval illuminated manuscript, the Book of Kells, or the Lindisfarne Gospels. Except instead of depicting saints and scripture, it depicts the contents of one man's unconscious mind. Dragons, towers, rivers of fire, conversations with figures from myth and archetype. A dialogue between Jung and his own soul that begins with the words, "My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak, I call you. Are you there?" And it was this 16-year journey into his own darkness that produced the concept for which Jung is best known: the shadow. The shadow is the part of you that you refuse to see, the part you hide from others and from yourself, the desires you're ashamed of, the capacities you deny, the impulses you push down and pretend don't exist. Jung argued that everyone has a shadow, and that the people who refuse to acknowledge theirs are the most dangerous of all, because the shadow doesn't go away when you deny it. It gets stronger. It leaks out sideways, in rage, in projection, in the tendency to see in others the very flaws we refuse to see in ourselves. The person who constantly accuses others of dishonesty may be hiding their own deceptions. The moralist who rails against sin may be wrestling with desires they can't face, The shadow is patient. It waits. And when you're not looking, it runs the show. No one can become conscious of the shadow, Jung wrote, without considerable moral effort. That's the dangerous idea, not that evil exists. Everyone knows that. The dangerous idea is that evil exists inside you, inside me, inside the kindest, most moral person you know. And that pretending otherwise, denying the shadow, projecting it onto enemies and scapegoats and people who are different from you, is the most dangerous thing a human being can do. Jung never published the Red Book. He feared it would destroy his scientific reputation. After his death in 1961, his family locked it in a Swiss bank vault. It remained there for decades. Scholars knew of its existence. Jung had referred to it in his autobiography, but no one was allowed to see it. It took 13 years of negotiation before historian Sonu Shamdasani was finally granted access. The book was published in 2009, 48 years after Jung's death. "The years when I pursued the inner images," Jung wrote toward the end of his life, "were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this." Jung dove into the darkness inside himself. But the last thinker on our journey tonight, he diagnosed the darkness inside all of us. He saw a catastrophe coming that would swallow the 20th century whole. And then he lost his mind. I want to end tonight with a man whose most famous words have been misunderstood for over a century. God is dead. Most people hear that and think, celebration, triumph, an atheist planting his flag, Nietzsche, the God-killer, dancing on the grave of religion. That is almost exactly the opposite of what Friedrich Nietzsche meant. God is dead was a warning, a terrified, desperate, anguished warning about what was about to happen to Western civilization. Nietzsche saw, with the horrible clarity of a man staring at a slow-motion disaster, that the foundations were crumbling, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs that nobody was prepared for what would come when they finally collapsed. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a small town in Saxony. His father was a Lutheran pastor. His grandfathers were Lutheran pastors. He was steeped in the Christian tradition from birth, and it was precisely because he understood Christianity so deeply that he recognized, earlier than almost anyone else, that its grip on Western culture was failing. By God is dead, Nietzsche didn't mean that a deity had literally ceased to exist. He meant that the entire moral and philosophical framework that Western civilization had been built upon, the idea that there is an objective moral order, that human life has inherent meaning, that right and wrong are absolute, was losing its hold on the human mind. Science was eating away at religious certainty. The Enlightenment had placed reason above revelation, and most people, Nietzsche saw, hadn't yet reckoned with the consequences. Because here's the thing. When you remove God from the center of a civilization's moral universe, you don't just remove a deity. You remove the foundation. You remove the answer to why should I be good? You remove the guarantee that suffering has meaning. You remove the promise that justice will eventually prevail. You remove the story that holds everything together. And what fills the vacuum? Nietzsche's answer, nihilism. The belief that nothing matters. That life has no inherent purpose or value. That morality is merely a human invention with no binding authority. And he predicted, correctly, devastatingly, that this nihilism would not lead to a gentle, philosophical acceptance of meaninglessness. It would lead to madness. It would lead to totalitarianism. It would lead to people desperately grasping at any ideology that promised certainty, no matter how monstrous. He was writing this in the 1880s. The 20th century, with its world wars, its gulags, its concentration camps, its nuclear weapons, its ideological mass murders, had not yet begun. But Nietzsche saw it coming. He saw it coming the way Jung later saw rivers of blood before World War I. Not as prophecy, but as diagnosis. The patient was sick, the fever was rising, and nobody was listening to the doctor. Now, let me tell you how the story ends, because the ending is the cruelest part. In 1888, Nietzsche was writing with a feverish intensity that bordered on mania. He produced 5 books in a single year, including Ecce Homo, an autobiography with chapter titles that tell you everything about his state of mind, why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books, why I am a destiny. These are either the words of the greatest genius in history, or the words of a man who is losing his mind. And that is the terrible ambiguity at the heart of Nietzsche's final months. Where did the brilliance end and the madness begin? Was there a line, or were they the same thing? His behavior was escalating. He danced nude around his room. He played piano for hours tunelessly. He discarded money in his wastebasket. And then came the letters of insanity, bizarre missives sent to friends and strangers, commanding the German emperor to go to Rome to be shot, demanding the abolition of Wilhelm, Bismarck, and all anti-Semites, signed not with his own name, but as Dionysus. The god of wine and ecstasy, the god of creative destruction. Then came January 3rd, 1889. Turin. The story that everyone tells goes like this. Nietzsche was walking through the Piazza Carlo Alberto when he saw a cab driver furiously whipping his horse. In a burst of compassion, Nietzsche rushed to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed in tears. He never recovered his sanity. It's a beautiful story. It's cinematic. It echoes the horse-beating scene in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a writer Nietzsche admired deeply. And it is almost certainly not true. The horse story was first told 11 years after the event, by an unnamed journalist who recounted a version he'd heard from Nietzsche's landlord, who had himself heard it from a nameless police officer. It is, as scholars consistently note, third-hand hearsay. One commentator calls it apocryphal, another calls it outright fictional. And there's a practical problem. Nietzsche was nearly blind by this point. How would he have seen a coachman wielding a whip across a public square? What we know for certain is this. Something broke. Whatever happened on that January morning, Nietzsche crossed a threshold from which he never returned. His friend Franz Overbeck rushed to Turin and found him raving and incoherent. To coax Nietzsche out of his lodgings, Overbeck, the landlord, and a local dentist engaged in an extraordinary bit of theatre. They treated the philosopher as royalty, promising him that a grand reception awaited. Nietzsche, playing the role perfectly, put on his landlord's nightcap as a crown and was led out of his rooms. He never wrote another word. For 11 years, from 1889 to 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche lived in a catatonic state, cared for first by his mother, then by his sister. His final recorded words, uttered to his mother were, "Mutter, ich bin dumm." Mother, I am stupid. And here is where the story becomes truly vicious. Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, was a devout Lutheran and an anti-Semite. She had married a man named Bernhard Forster, a prominent anti-Semitic agitator who had attempted to establish a pure Aryan colony in Paraguay. It failed miserably. Nietzsche himself despised anti-Semitism. He despised German nationalism. He wrote scathingly about both. He once said that anti-Semites should be shot. But with her brother silent and helpless, Elizabeth had control of his unpublished writings, and she used that control to do something unforgivable. She edited his notes and manuscripts, adding passages, removing passages, reorganizing his ideas to align them with her own anti-Semitic and proto-fascist ideology. She forged nearly 30 of his letters. She created a book called The Will to Power from fragments and notes that Nietzsche had specifically discarded, arranging them in a way he never intended and presenting them as his definitive work. The philosopher Rudolf Steiner, yes, the same Rudolf Steiner who founded Waldorf education, was hired to tutor Elizabeth in her brother's philosophy. He abandoned the attempt after a few months, declaring it was impossible to teach her anything. He called her a complete layperson in everything concerning her brother's teaching, who does not have any independent judgment about the simplest of these teachings. But Elizabeth had something Steiner didn't: control of the archive. And when the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, they found in Elizabeth's carefully curated version of Nietzsche exactly what they needed: a philosophical justification for racial supremacy, for the will to power as domination, for the Übermensch as the Aryan master race. It was the exact opposite of everything Nietzsche believed. The man who warned about nihilism had his own ideas twisted into the most nihilistic ideology in modern history. The man who despised anti-Semitism was claimed by anti-Semites. The man who saw the catastrophe coming was used to justify the catastrophe itself. And here's what haunts me most about Nietzsche's story. He was on the verge of fame when he lost his mind. In 1887, he was virtually unknown outside a tiny circle. His books were printed in editions of a few hundred copies. But by 1888, his ideas were just beginning to reach a wider audience. If his mind had held together for just a few more years, he would have lived to see the recognition he'd craved his entire life. Instead, he spent 11 years in silence, a prophet without a voice, a warning without a speaker, a mind as powerful as any in history, extinguished just before the world was ready to listen. Nietzsche's dangerous idea was never, God is dead as a celebration. His dangerous idea was the question that followed. What do you build your life on when the old foundations crumble? And in an age of declining religious adherence, rising existential anxiety, and the constant grinding question of whether anything really matters, that question has never been more relevant than it is right now. What do you build your life on? Let me tell you something strange about the human capacity for denial. In the early 1600s, a man in Padua built a telescope. Not the first telescope. He improved an existing Dutch design. But it was the first telescope aimed at the heavens by a mind sharp enough to understand what it was seeing. And what Galileo Galilei saw changed everything. He saw mountains on the moon, craters and valleys and shadows that proved the moon was not a perfect divine sphere, but a world, rough and imperfect like Earth. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, which proved that not everything in the cosmos orbited Earth. He saw the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth. He saw the truth, and here's the strange part. When he invited other scholars to look through his telescope, some of them refused. They would not even put their eye to the lens. The Aristotelian philosopher Cesare Cremonini allegedly declined to look, afraid that what he saw might contradict what he believed. Think about that for a moment. A man of learning offered direct evidence of how the universe works. And he turned away, because the truth was more frightening than ignorance. Now, Galileo was not a reckless man. He was actually quite politically savvy. When he first published his telescopic observations in 1610, in a little book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, he dedicated it to Cosimo de' Medici and named Jupiter's moons after the Medici family. Flattery as insurance. Smart move. And for a while, it worked. Galileo became the most famous scientist in Europe. He was celebrated by popes and princes. Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a man who genuinely admired Galileo's work, wrote him poems praising his discoveries. Then Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. And Galileo made the mistake that would cost him everything. See, the Pope had given Galileo permission to write a book comparing the old Earth-centered model of the universe with the new Sun-centered model. There was one condition. Galileo had to present both sides fairly, without favoring either. The Pope even gave Galileo a specific argument to include a philosophical point about how God, being omnipotent, could make the universe work in ways humans could not fully comprehend. Galileo wrote the book. He called it Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It was published in 1632, and it was brilliant. But Galileo made a catastrophic error. He structured the book as a conversation between three characters. Salviati, the brilliant scientist who argues for the sun-centered model. Sagredo, the intelligent layman who asks good questions, and Simplicio, the fool. And Galileo put the Pope's own argument, the one Urban had specifically asked to be included, into the mouth of Simplicio. The fool! The Pope was furious. This wasn't just scientific disagreement anymore. This was personal betrayal. A friend had mocked him in front of all of Europe. On April 12, 1633, Galileo stood trial before the Roman Inquisition. He was 69 years old, ailing, exhausted from the journey to Rome. The trial was, in many ways, a foregone conclusion. A plea bargain was arranged, confess to going too far, receive a lighter sentence. On June 22, 1633, Galileo knelt before the assembled court and was forced to recite a formal abjuration. He abjured, cursed, and detested the idea that the earth moves around the sun. Think about that. A man who had seen the truth with his own eyes, who had the mathematical proof, who knew with absolute certainty that the earth orbits the sun, was forced to kneel and say the opposite. To unsee what he had seen, to unknow what he knew. And here's the part that gets me. You've probably heard the famous story, that after recanting, Galileo muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove." And yet it moves. It's one of the most iconic moments in the history of science. Defiance in the face of power. The truth refusing to stay silent. But it almost certainly never happened. The first written account of those words appeared in 1757, over a century after Galileo's trial, in a book by Giuseppe Baretti. No contemporary source records it. Galileo was an old, frightened man standing before the most powerful institution on earth. He did not mutter defiant phrases. He knelt. He recanted. He went home. And that, somehow, makes the story more powerful, not less. Because Galileo's courage wasn't in some cinematic act of whispered defiance. His courage was in what he did next. He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. His dialogue was banned. All his future writings were forbidden from publication. He was effectively silenced. But Galileo was not done. Blind, aging, confined to his villa in Arcetri, he wrote another book. Discourses on Two New Sciences, published in 1638, when he was 74 years old. He had to smuggle the manuscript out of Italy to get it published. It was printed in the Netherlands, beyond the Inquisition's reach. And this book, written by a blind man under house arrest whose previous work had been banned, became one of the foundational texts of modern physics. He couldn't publish in Italy. So he published in Holland. He couldn't see. So he dictated. He couldn't teach. So he wrote. The Inquisition could silence him in Rome, but they couldn't silence him in Amsterdam. It took the Vatican 359 years to formally acknowledge that Galileo was right and to clear his name. That was 1992. 1992. The same year the first text message was sent. Galileo's dangerous idea was never just heliocentrism. His dangerous idea was that observation trumps authority. That what you see through a lens matters more than what you read in a book. That the universe doesn't care about your theology, your politics, or your pope. And the most telling detail? Some of his contemporaries literally refused to look through his telescope. They chose blindness, they chose ignorance, they chose comfort over truth. We still do that, don't we? Every day, when the evidence is right there, and we just won't look. My mother gave birth to twins, myself and Fear. That's not a metaphor. Well, it's partly a metaphor, but it's rooted in fact. On April the 5th, 1588, Thomas Hobbes's mother went into premature labour upon hearing that the Spanish Armada had set sail to invade England. The terror of an approaching fleet induced such panic that she delivered her son weeks early. And Hobbes, perhaps the most sardonic philosopher who ever lived, turned this into the founding story of his entire philosophical system. Fear, he argued, is the fundamental human motivator. Not love, not reason, not divine inspiration. Fear of death, fear of each other, fear of what happens when the rules break down. He was born afraid, and he built a philosophy of fear that changed the world. Now here's what makes Hobbes genuinely fascinating as a character. He described human life in the natural state, without government, without laws, without the social contract, with 5 of the most quoted words in the history of philosophy: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And then he lived to be 91 years old. 91. In the 17th century, when average life expectancy was somewhere around 40. The man who said life was nasty, brutish, and short had one of the longest and most productive lives of any philosopher in history. If that isn't cosmic irony, I don't know what is. But let me tell you the story properly. Because Hobbes's life is wilder than most people realize. His father was an alcoholic clergyman in Wiltshire who got into a fight at the door of his own church. Not a theological disagreement, an actual physical fight. After the brawl, he abandoned his 3 children and was never heard from again. Little Thomas was raised by his uncle, a successful glover, who recognized the boy's brilliance and funded his education. And the boy was brilliant. Hobbes went to Oxford at 14. He became a tutor to the Cavendish family, travelled across Europe, and met some of the greatest minds of his age. He personally met Galileo. He debated with Descartes. He moved in circles that included Francis Bacon and Ben Jonson. But it was the English Civil War, the bloody, brutal conflict that tore England apart in the 1640s, that forced Hobbes to confront the question that would define his legacy. What happens when civilization collapses? He had seen it firsthand. A king beheaded, a nation at war with itself, neighbour killing neighbour over politics and religion. And in the middle of this chaos, living in exile in Paris, Hobbes sat down and wrote Leviathan. Published in 1651, Leviathan argued something that offended literally everyone. Hobbes said that humans in their natural state exist in a war of all against all, and that the only way to escape this horror is to surrender your individual freedoms entirely to a sovereign power, an absolute ruler, a Leviathan. The royalists hated it because Hobbes denied the divine right of kings. The parliamentarians hated it because he dismissed democracy. The Catholics hated it because he argued the ruler should control religion. The Protestants hated it for the same reason. He managed to offend every faction in a nation already tearing itself apart over faction. And the response was extraordinary. Hobbes was called the Monster of Malmesbury. He was called the Bugbear of the Nation. Bishop Bramhall called his book A Rebel's Catechism. Some members of Parliament actually proposed legislation specifically targeting his writings, and this one is genuinely remarkable. In 1666, after the Great Fire of London, some parliamentarians blamed Hobbes's book for causing the fire, as if a philosophical treatise could literally ignite a city. His books were burned at Oxford in 1666, the same university where he'd studied as a boy. Hobbes spent the rest of his life dodging censorship, accusations of atheism, and periodic threats of prosecution. And you know what he did with those years? In his 80s, he produced new English translations of both Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He wrote an autobiography in Latin verse. He continued publishing philosophical works until the very end. He died in 1679, at 91, having outlived virtually every single person who had tried to silence him. And here's the thing about Hobbes that I think most people miss. His philosophy sounds authoritarian. It sounds like a defense of tyranny. And yes, in its crudest form, it is. But Hobbes was also asking the most fundamental question of political life, a question we're still grappling with today. How much freedom are you willing to give up in exchange for safety? Every time a government invokes emergency powers, every time a surveillance program is justified by national security, every time a pandemic lockdown restricts individual liberty for collective health. That's Hobbes. That's the question he put on the table in 1651, and we have never answered it satisfactorily. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. The man who said those words outlived kings, survived civil wars, translated Homer, and kept writing into his 10th decade. Fear, it turns out, can keep you alive for a very long time. Charles Darwin had a secret. For nearly 20 years, from the late 1830s until 1859, he knew something that would shake the foundations of Western civilization. He had worked it out on the Beagle voyage, refined it through years of meticulous observation, and become virtually certain of its truth. Every species on Earth, including humans, descended from common ancestors through a process of natural variation and selection. There was no divine plan, no special creation, no Garden of Eden, just an endless branching tree of life, shaped by competition, adaptation, and death over millions of years. And he told almost nobody. Why? Well, the standard story is that Darwin was afraid. Afraid of the church, afraid of public ridicule, afraid of what his theory would do to society. And there's some truth in that. He once compared revealing his theory to confessing a murder. He'd seen what happened to his grandfather Erasmus, who had been mocked and ostracized for publishing about transmutation of species. Darwin knew what was coming. But here's the thing that's often missed. Recent scholarship from Cambridge historian Dr. John Van Wy has challenged the fear narrative. Van Wy argues there's no direct evidence that Darwin was afraid to publish. Instead, Darwin was simply doing what a good scientist does, gathering an enormous body of evidence for an enormously ambitious multi-volume work. He wasn't hiding, he was working. But there's another dimension to Darwin's delay that I find far more moving. And it involves a 10-year-old girl named Annie. Annie Darwin was Charles's eldest daughter. And by every account, she was extraordinary. Bright, cheerful, affectionate. Darwin adored her. He called her his dear Annie, and later wrote a memorial describing her as a most vigorous, happy, and enthusiastic child. She was, friends and family agreed, the light of the household. In 1851, Annie fell gravely ill. It may have been tuberculosis, or possibly Crohn's disease. The records aren't clear. Darwin took her to Malvern for treatment, but she grew worse. On April 23, 1851, Annie died. She was 10 years old. Darwin was so devastated he could not attend her burial. Now, this is where the story becomes profound. Darwin's wife Emma was a devout Christian. Charles had been losing his faith gradually for years, and his theory was one of the reasons. If nature operated through blind selection rather than divine purpose, then what role was left for God? Annie's death accelerated this crisis. A loving God who allows a 10-year-old girl to die slowly of disease did not fit the evidence. But here's what historian Deborah Heiligman discovered. Annie's death, rather than driving Charles and Emma apart over religion, actually brought them closer together. The loss was, as Heiligman put it, so much the worst thing that could happen to them. And they survived it that it was almost like anything else paled in comparison. After Annie, Darwin became more willing to speak openly about his theories and his doubts, and Emma, though still devout, turned toward her husband rather than away from him. There's something deeply human in that. A man who held back the most revolutionary scientific idea in history, partly out of love for a woman whose faith it would challenge, and a shared grief that freed him, finally, to speak. In 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist working in Southeast Asia, sent Darwin a letter outlining a strikingly similar theory of natural selection. Darwin was shaken. After 20 years of cautious, methodical work, someone else had reached the same conclusion independently. His hand was forced. On November 24, 1859, On the Origin of Species was published. The first printing sold out immediately. The backlash was everything Darwin had feared. Newspapers printed satirical cartoons depicting him with a monkey's head. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, Soapy Sam, publicly attacked the theory. Queen Victoria had considered granting Darwin a knighthood, but her ecclesiastical advisers blocked it after Origin was published. The same advisers cited the precedent of Galileo. They did not want to honor someone who challenged Scripture again. And here's a detail I find particularly telling. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, was inspired directly by Darwin's theory. The idea that beneath every civilized gentleman lurks an animal nature, that's Darwin. That's the dangerous idea made flesh, literally. Darwin's revolutionary insight is sometimes dismissed as obvious in hindsight. Of course species evolve. Of course humans are related to other primates. It seems self-evident now. But according to Pew Research, roughly a third of Americans still reject evolution entirely. 167 years after publication, a third. Darwin's dangerous idea is still, for many millions of people, too dangerous to accept. Annie would have been proud of her father. I think he knew that. And I think, in the end, that's what gave him the courage to speak. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That single sentence, 7 words, made Aleister Crowley the most feared, the most hated, and possibly the most misunderstood figure of the 20th century. The British tabloids called him the wickedest man in the world. His own mother called him the Beast when he was a child. He adopted the title enthusiastically, referring to himself for the rest of his life as the Great Beast 666. And you know what? He would have loved that introduction. Crowley was above all else a showman, a provocateur, a man who understood that notoriety is its own kind of power. But underneath the theatrics was a mind that was genuinely extraordinary, and a life that was stranger than any novel could contain. Edward Alexander Crowley was born in 1875 in Royal Leamington Spa to a wealthy family of Plymouth Brethren, a strict, puritanical Christian sect. His father was a travelling preacher. His mother was devout. Young Aleister was raised on hellfire, biblical literalism, and the absolute certainty that pleasure was sin. He rebelled completely, thoroughly, in every conceivable direction. First, he chose his name using metrical analysis. He had read that the most favourable name for achieving fame was a dactyl followed by a spondee, the rhythm at the end of a hexameter line in classical poetry. Aleister Crowley fit perfectly. He literally re-engineered his own name for maximum memorability. That's either genius or madness, possibly both. At Cambridge, he began experimenting with occultism and mountaineering, 2 pursuits that seem unrelated until you realize they share a common thread: the desire to reach places other people can't or won't. And Crowley was genuinely a world-class mountaineer. Most people don't know this. In 1902, he was among the first Westerners to attempt K2, the world's most dangerous mountain. He reached 18,600 feet. His suggested route, later named the Abruzzi Spur, was the one eventually used for the first successful ascent 52 years later. In 1905, he attempted Kanchenjunga, the world's third highest peak. But the Kanchenjunga expedition ended in disaster. After conflicts with his team, 4 climbers decided to descend against Crowley's warnings. They were killed in an avalanche. Crowley was accused of ignoring their cries for help. The tragedy haunted him, though how much genuine remorse he felt is debatable. Crowley was not a man given to self-doubt. In 1904, in Cairo, something happened that would define the rest of his life. While visiting Egypt with his first wife Rose Kelly, Crowley claimed that a discarnate entity called Aiwas dictated to him the Book of the Law, the foundational text of his new religion, the Lema. Rose, who had no prior interest in the occult, allegedly entered a trance and led Crowley to a museum exhibit featuring an Egyptian artifact, the Stele of Revealing. Its exhibit number? 666. Over 3 consecutive days in April, Crowley transcribed what he claimed was being dictated to him. The central commandment, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." This was not, as it's often misunderstood, a license for hedonism. Crowley meant something more specific, that every individual has a unique, true will, a deep, authentic purpose, and the highest moral imperative is to discover and pursue it without compromise. But the way he lived, that philosophy guaranteed maximum scandal. He was openly bisexual in an era when homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain. He frequented prostitutes. He was an enthusiastic drug user. Opium, cocaine, heroin, mescaline. He vocally attacked Christianity at every opportunity. When a young follower died in Sicily under mysterious circumstances after allegedly participating in occult rituals, the British press went berserk. Mussolini expelled him from Italy. France deported him. And then there's the spy theory. Multiple biographers, Richard Spence, Tobias Churton, have presented evidence that Crowley was recruited by British intelligence at Cambridge and served as a spy throughout his life. He associated with Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, through Britain's Naval Intelligence Division. During World War I, he allegedly wrote deliberately absurd pro-German propaganda for an American newspaper. The theory being that the propaganda was so over the top, it would discredit the German cause from within, whether this was genuine espionage or Crowley embellishing his own legend. Nobody knows for certain. He appears on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. David Bowie referenced him. Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page bought his former home in Scotland. In a 2002 BBC poll, Crowley was voted the 73rd greatest Briton. And yet, he died in 1947 in a boarding house in Hastings, virtually penniless. Despite being born wealthy, his lifestyle had consumed everything. His funeral was attended by only a few friends and was described by horrified newspapers as the Black Mass. There's a final detail about Crowley that I find, well, I'll let you decide what to make of it. His last doctor had been prescribing him morphine for years. Near the end, the doctor allegedly reduced or cut off the prescription. Crowley, furious, reportedly cursed him. The doctor died within 24 hours of Crowley's death. Coincidence, obviously. But it's exactly the kind of coincidence that follows a man who spent his entire life cultivating the image of the great beast. The wickedest man in the world, taking one final curtain call. Crowley's dangerous idea, do what thou wilt, has been twisted and misunderstood for over a century. Most people hear it as, do whatever you want. But Crowley meant something closer, to discover who you truly are, beneath all the conditioning and expectation, and then live that truth without apology. Which, when you strip away the occult trappings and the tabloid headlines, is pretty much what every therapist tells you. Find your authentic self. Live it. Don't let anyone else's expectations dictate your life. The wickedest man in the world, whose most dangerous idea was, be yourself. Maybe that's why it scared people so much. Before Sigmund Freud became the most controversial figure in the history of psychology, he spent his early career looking for eel testicles. I'm not joking. As a young zoology student, Freud was assigned the task of finding the male reproductive organs of the European eel, a mystery that had baffled scientists for centuries. He dissected over 400 eels, squinting through a microscope, searching for gonads that seemed not to exist. After weeks of fruitless dissection, he reported with evident frustration, all the eels I have cut open are of the tenderer sex. He never found them. The eel testicle mystery wouldn't be solved until decades later. But this early failure tells you something important about Freud. He was a man obsessed with what is hidden, what is concealed beneath the surface, what the organism doesn't want you to see. It's the same instinct that would lead him, years later, to propose his most dangerous idea, that the human mind is an iceberg, and consciousness, the part we're aware of, the part we think of as us, is just the tiny tip above the waterline. Below the surface lies a vast, churning ocean of repressed desires, forgotten traumas, sexual impulses, and aggressive instincts that drive our behavior without our knowledge or consent. The unconscious mind. The idea that you don't know why you do what you do. That your rational explanations are stories you tell yourself to cover up the real reasons. Reasons you can't face. That was the dangerous idea, and Victorian society was not ready for it. But before we get to the unconscious, let me tell you about the cocaine. In 1884, a young, ambitious Freud was desperate for a breakthrough. He was 28 years old, brilliant but unknown, working as a clinical assistant in Vienna, and barely making enough money to marry his fiancée, Martha Bernays. He needed a discovery, something that would make his name. He found cocaine. Through a German army physician's paper, Freud learned about the stimulating properties of the coca plant. He obtained samples and began experimenting on himself. He was immediately enchanted. Cocaine, he found, elevated his mood, sharpened his thinking, and eliminated fatigue. He began using it regularly. He recommended it to friends. He gave it to Martha. He wrote her a letter on June 2nd, 1884. That is, well, let's just say it's passionate. Woe to you, my princess, when I come. I will kiss you quite red, and feed you till you are plump. And if you are forward, you shall see who is the stronger. A gentle little girl who doesn't eat enough, or a big wild man who has cocaine in his body. That, by the way, is not from a novel. That is a real letter. From the founder of psychoanalysis to his fiancée, while high on cocaine. Freud published a paper called On Coca in 1885, enthusiastically promoting cocaine as a miracle cure for depression, fatigue, and morphine addiction. The pharmaceutical company Parker Davis, now part of Pfizer, paid the 28-year-old $24 to endorse their cocaine product, one of the first celebrity pharmaceutical endorsements in history. But then the cocaine story turned dark. Freud gave cocaine to his close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, who was addicted to morphine. The idea was that cocaine would help wean him off. Instead, Fleischl-Marxow developed a devastating cocaine addiction, on top of his morphine habit. Other addiction cases and overdose deaths began appearing across Europe. Freud's reputation was damaged. And here's the really painful part. While experimenting with cocaine, Freud noticed something odd. It numbed the surfaces it touched. He tested it on a dog's eye and observed a local anesthetic effect. He suggested his colleague Karl Koller investigate further. But then Freud left Vienna to visit Martha. While he was away, Koller conducted the experiments, confirmed the anesthetic effect, and presented the findings. Koller became world famous overnight for revolutionizing eye surgery. Freud lost what could have been his greatest medical contribution, the discovery of local anesthesia, because he went to see his girlfriend. So there he was, failed to find eel testicles, failed with cocaine, missed discovering anesthesia by a weekend. And then, everything changed. In the 1890s, Freud developed the method he called free association, asking patients to say whatever came to mind without censoring themselves and listening for the patterns beneath. He published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, arguing that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. He developed concepts that would enter everyday language: the id, the ego, the superego, defense mechanisms, repression, projection, the Oedipus complex. And every single one of these ideas scandalized polite society. Freud told Victorian parents that their children had sexual desires. He told respectable ladies that their hysterical symptoms were rooted in repressed sexuality. He told civilization itself that it was built on a foundation of suppressed violence and forbidden wishes. He said essentially that the rational, moral, civilized human being is a performance, and underneath the performance we are all seething cauldrons of desire and aggression. The response was predictable. He was called a pervert, a fraud, a dangerous obsessive. His seduction theory, the idea that neurosis stemmed from childhood sexual abuse, was so explosive that he eventually modified it, saying the memories could be fantasies rather than real events. Both the original theory and the modification provoked outrage. When the Nazis burned books in 1933, Freud's were among the first into the fire. His response was characteristically dry. What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books. He was wrong about that. 4 of his sisters died in Nazi concentration camps. Freud himself escaped to London in 1938, thanks to the intervention of Princess Marie Bonaparte, who paid the Nazis a ransom for his release. He arrived in England with his cancer and his cigars. He smoked more than 20 a day, despite having undergone 33 surgeries for oral cancer over 16 years. He refused to quit. He believed tobacco enhanced his creativity. On September 21st, 1939, with the cancer now unbearable, Freud grasped his doctor's hand and said, "Now it is nothing but torture and makes no sense." His doctor administered 3 doses of morphine. Freud slipped into a coma and never woke. His ashes were placed in an ancient Greek vase, a bell crater painted with scenes of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and abandon. Even in death, the symbolism was perfect. Now, here's the thing about Freud's legacy. Much of what he specifically proposed has been revised, modified, or outright rejected. The Oedipus complex, penis envy, the specific structure of id-ego-superego. These are largely historical artifacts now. Modern psychology has moved on. But his core insight, that unconscious processes drive much of human behavior, that we are not the rational agents we believe ourselves to be, has been broadly confirmed by modern neuroscience. Brain imaging studies have shown that decisions are often made below the level of conscious awareness. Implicit bias research demonstrates that prejudices operate without our knowledge. The entire field of behavioral economics is built on the discovery that humans are systematically irrational in ways they don't recognize. Freud was wrong about the details, but he was right about the iceberg. And sometimes, being right about the shape of the iceberg matters more than mapping every crevice. In 1975, a young Australian philosopher published a book called Animal Liberation. It argued something that most people found genuinely monstrous: that giving moral priority to humans simply because they are human is a prejudice, no different in principle from racism or sexism. Peter Singer called this prejudice speciesism. And then he took the argument to its logical conclusion. If suffering is what matters morally, if a being's capacity to feel pain is what gives it a claim to ethical consideration, then a healthy adult chimpanzee, with its rich emotional life, its capacity for suffering, its social bonds, has a stronger moral claim than a severely brain-damaged human infant who will never develop consciousness. He said that. He published that. And he meant it. When Princeton University appointed Singer as DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in 1999, approximately 200 protesters rallied outside. Disability rights activists called him the most dangerous man in the world. Not the most dangerous philosopher, the most dangerous man. They called him an enemy of civilization and a philosophical hypocrite. His lectures have been physically disrupted around the world. In Zurich, a protester jumped on stage and grabbed his glasses. In Germany, his positions were compared to Nazi ideology, university courses using his books were boycotted, and a symposium invitation was withdrawn. And here's the detail that makes that Nazi comparison particularly grotesque. 3 of Singer's grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. Singer is not a monster. He is something arguably more unsettling. He is a man who follows logical arguments wherever they lead, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination. And the destination of his arguments has, at times, been extraordinarily uncomfortable. His most influential contribution is deceptively simple. It's called the drowning child thought experiment. And it goes like this. Imagine you're walking past a shallow pond. You see a small child drowning. Wading in would be easy and safe, but it would ruin your expensive new shoes. No reasonable person would think that ruined shoes justify letting a child die. Now, Singer says, consider this. People in wealthy nations are in exactly this position relative to children dying of preventable diseases and poverty around the world. Every time you buy a luxury you don't need, you are choosing your shoes over a drowning child. That argument is very hard to refute. Philosophers have been trying for 50 years. They haven't really succeeded. You can quibble with the analogy. You can raise objections about distance, responsibility, institutional failures. But the core logic is devastatingly simple. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Singer himself lives by his principles with a consistency that is either admirable or terrifying, depending on your perspective. When he won the 2021 Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture, worth $1 million, he donated the entire sum, half to his organization, The Life You Can Save, 10% to poverty charities, and 40% to animal advocacy groups. $1 million gone. Because ruined shoes. His ideas about animal rights launched the modern animal rights movement. His drowning child argument inspired the effective altruism movement, which has redirected billions of dollars toward evidence-based charitable giving. He co-founded the Journal of Controversial Ideas, an academic journal that allows authors to publish under pseudonyms to protect them from the kind of backlash that Singer himself has endured for decades. But his positions on disability and infanticide continue to provoke fierce, genuine moral outrage. He has argued that in some cases, the painless killing of a severely disabled newborn, a being that is not yet self-aware, not yet capable of grasping its own existence over time, is morally permissible. He has written, "Human babies are not born self-aware, or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons." That sentence, read it again. Let it sit with you. Singer would tell you that your revulsion is emotional, not rational, that you are confusing the sanctity of human DNA with the morality of suffering, that the yuck factor is not an argument. And he might be right. Or he might be catastrophically wrong. The history of civilization includes many ideas that felt intuitively monstrous and turned out to be correct. And many ideas that felt intuitively monstrous and turned out to be monstrous. The question Singer forces you to ask is, how do you tell the difference? How do you distinguish a dangerous truth from a genuinely dangerous idea? That's the question that has made Peter Singer the most controversial living philosopher on earth. And it's a question, I should warn you, that does not have a comfortable answer. In the 1790s, while revolution swept through France and terrified the monarchies of Europe, a nearly unknown engraver in London was writing his own revolution. Not with muskets or guillotines, with copper plates, acid, and imagination. William Blake was 52 years old and nobody. His engravings earned him a modest living. His poetry was virtually unread. He had sold perhaps a dozen copies of any given work. He was, to most who knew him, an eccentric craftsman with a tendency to say unusual things about angels. What they didn't know, what almost nobody knew until long after his death, was that Blake was producing some of the most radical, political, and spiritual art ever created. And he was doing it using a technology he'd invented specifically to evade government censorship. Here's the backstory. In the 1790s, Britain was terrified of revolution spreading from France. The government was cracking down on dissent with brutal efficiency. Printers and publishers who distributed seditious material faced imprisonment. The entire publishing industry was effectively under surveillance. Blake's solution was brilliant. He invented a printing method called relief etching, which allowed him to combine text and images on a single copper plate. He would write his poetry backward in acid-resistant varnish, then etch the plate so the words and pictures emerged as raised surfaces that could be inked and printed. This wasn't just artistic innovation. It was a survival strategy. Blake's illuminated books bypassed the normal publishing system entirely. They were not typeset by a compositor who might report seditious content. They were not reviewed by a publisher who might refuse to print them. They were not distributed through bookshops that could be raided. Blake wrote them, printed them, coloured them by hand, and sold them directly. His radical ideas were hidden in plain sight. And the authorities, who could barely read the intricate combination of text and image, even if they happened to see a copy, simply didn't notice. What was he hiding? Everything. In 1790, Blake began writing The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a work deliberately structured as the anti-Bible. It contained what he called the Proverbs of Hell, a series of philosophical provocations designed to demolish every moral certainty of his age. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. These were not casual aphorisms. They were precision-targeted attacks on the Enlightenment, the Church, and the State. Blake was arguing something truly incendiary. That what society calls evil, passion, energy, desire, imagination, is actually the driving force of life. And what society calls good, obedience, restraint, reason, moral conformity, is actually the machinery of spiritual death. He put it more directly. Without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. Blake wasn't an atheist. He was something more dangerous, a man who claimed direct personal access to the divine, bypassing every institution that claimed to mediate between humans and God. He saw his first vision at age 4. God, he said, put his face to the window. At age 8, he saw a tree filled with angels, their bright wings lighting every bough. Throughout his life, he claimed to converse with the spirits of the dead, Milton, Dante, the prophets. His contemporaries thought he was insane. The scholar Alan Cunningham established a lasting image of Blake as a furious maverick whose fiercely energetic art is a reflex of mental instability. For over a century after his death, that was the official verdict. Brilliant, but mad. And Blake challenged everything. He attacked God as a remote monarch and lawgiver who demanded blind obedience. He attacked Newton's mechanical universe as a prison for the imagination. He attacked the slave trade. He attacked colonialism. He attacked sexual repression. He attacked the factory system that was grinding children into dust. In 1803, he was put on trial for sedition after a soldier alleged that Blake had uttered treasonous statements. He was acquitted, but the trial shook him deeply. He retreated further into his art, producing his most complex and cryptic works, prophecies so dense with symbolism that they still haven't been fully decoded. He died in 1827 at age 69, in poverty and obscurity. On his deathbed, he was reportedly working on a series of illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy, the last act of a man who had spent his entire life redrawing the boundaries between heaven and hell. His wife, Catherine, who had been his partner in printing for over 40 years, died 4 years later. She had helped ink every plate, coloured every print by hand. She had been his collaborator in the truest sense, and her contribution has been systematically undervalued by history. Here's what gets me about Blake. His work was virtually unknown during his lifetime. He died thinking he had failed. He had no idea, could have had no idea, that his poetry would one day be quoted by millions, that The Tiger would become one of the most anthologized poems in the English language, that his Proverbs of Hell would be studied in every university on earth, that his illuminated books, those hand-printed, hand-colored objects that he sold for a few shillings each, would be valued at millions of pounds. He saw it all. He said it all. He wrote it down in acid and copper, in fire and ink. And nobody listened. Not then. But now, the Proverbs of Hell are everywhere. In philosophy seminars, in punk lyrics, in protest art, in every movement that insists imagination is more real than obedience. Blake's dangerous idea was simple. Devastatingly simple. You have a mind. Use it. Not the mind that society gave you, the careful, obedient, reasonable mind that follows rules and stays inside the lines. The other mind. The wild one. The one that sees angels in trees and hears the universe singing. No bird soars too high, Blake wrote, if he soars with his own wings. 20 thinkers, and that one line might be the most dangerous idea of all. Karl Marx was broke. Perpetually, exhaustingly, humiliatingly broke. Which is ironic, because the man who wrote the most influential critique of capitalism in human history was also spectacularly bad with money. In the 1850s and early 1860s, Marx, his wife Jenny, a baron's daughter who had married him despite her family's horrified objections, and their growing family were crammed into 2 or 3 rooms in London's Soho district. The furniture was wrecked. A chair missing a leg. A tattered sofa held together by hope. Everything coated in dust, surrounded by piles of manuscript pages, dirty teacups, and children's toys. The family frequently went without heat in winter. Of their 7 children, 4 died before reaching adolescence. Read that again. 4 of 7. In the home of the man who would write more about human welfare, about the exploitation of workers, about the suffering of the poor, than any philosopher before or since. His own children were dying of diseases that adequate food and warmth might have prevented. But here's the complicating detail that makes Marx such a maddening figure. Even during his worst years, recent scholarship suggests he earned roughly 3 times the income of an average skilled worker. He employed a private secretary. He sent his surviving daughters to private school. He took regular vacations. He wasn't destitute in the way his legend suggests. He was terrible with money. There's a difference. He pawned his wife's family silver so many times that once a pawnbroker suspected a poor refugee couldn't possibly own such fine pieces and had him briefly jailed on suspicion of theft. A baron's daughter, married to a philosopher, watching her heirlooms disappear into pawn shops. Jenny Marx's sacrifice is one of the great unsung tragedies of intellectual history. But I haven't told you about the carbuncles yet. From at least 1860, Marx suffered excruciating boils and skin abscesses, likely a condition called hidradenitis suppurativa, according to British dermatologist Sam Schuster. The boils erupted on his face, his back, his buttocks, his groin. They were so severe that he frequently could not sit down. He could not work upright at his desk. He wrote significant portions of Das Kapital lying on his stomach, scribbling in agony, and the condition was made catastrophically worse by his lifestyle. He worked through the night, chain-smoking cheap cigars. He drank heavily, beer, wine, spirits. His diet consisted of highly seasoned food, smoked fish, caviar, and pickled cucumbers, all of which aggravated his liver condition. He refused to exercise. He refused to change his habits. He was, by all accounts, stubborn to the point of self-destruction. In 1867, as he was finishing the first volume of Capital, Marx wrote to his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, "The bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles until their dying day." He meant it as dark humor. But there's a genuine scholarly argument, advanced by Schuster and others, that Marx's chronic pain shaped his intellectual output, his irritability, his savage, biting prose style, his merciless attacks on opponents, his inability to compromise or collaborate. Some of the most cutting passages in Capital, the ones that burn with fury at the exploitation of workers, may have been written by a man in physical torment, projecting his personal suffering onto the suffering of an entire class. The carbuncles that changed the world. It sounds absurd, but think about it. If Marx had been healthy, comfortable, well-fed, would he have written with the same white-hot rage? Would Capital carry the same visceral force? Would a content man have produced the most incendiary critique of contentment ever written? Now, the ideas themselves. Marx argued that private property is the root of all evil, that history is driven by class struggle, the endless conflict between those who own the means of production and those who work them, that capitalism is inherently exploitative, extracting surplus value from workers who have no choice but to sell their labor, and that this system would inevitably collapse, replaced by a communist society where the state itself withers away. He was wrong about the inevitability, spectacularly wrong. Capitalism did not collapse. It adapted. It reformed. It bent without breaking, at least so far. But here's where it gets complicated. The movements inspired by Marx, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, led to an estimated 100 to 200 million deaths in the 20th century. Gulags, famines, purges, cultural revolutions. The body count is staggering. And yet, the labor movements that won the 8-hour day, workplace safety laws, the weekend, child labor protections, the right to organize, all of these drew intellectual ammunition from Marx. The welfare states of Western Europe, universal healthcare, public education, social security, were built partly in response to the threat that Marx's ideas represented. The establishment reformed precisely because they feared the revolution Marx predicted. So here is the impossible question that Marx's legacy forces us to confront. Can an idea be simultaneously one of the most influential forces for good and one of the most devastating forces for evil in human history? Marx himself would have had a characteristically sharp answer, but he'd probably have delivered it lying on his stomach, wincing from a boil the size of a golf ball, smoking a terrible cigar. He died in 1883 at 64 in his armchair. His housekeeper found him. Only 11 people attended his funeral. The man whose ideas would reshape the lives of billions left the world almost as quietly as he entered it. Man lives his life in sleep, and in sleep he dies. George Ivanovich Gurdjieff said that, and he meant it literally, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Gurdjieff believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who had travelled through Central Asia, the Gobi Desert, and the monasteries of Tibet searching for hidden knowledge, that virtually every human being is unconscious. Awake in the biological sense, yes, eyes open, walking, talking, eating, working, but conscious, truly present, making genuine decisions rather than reacting mechanically to stimuli. No. According to Gurdjieff, you are asleep right now. You have always been asleep. And unless you do something extraordinarily difficult and painful to wake up, you will die in your sleep, having never genuinely lived a single moment. That was his dangerous idea, and the way he taught it was unlike anything in the history of philosophy. Nobody knows exactly when Gurdjieff was born. Estimates range from 1866 to 1877. His birthplace was probably Alexandria, in what is now Armenia, but even his parents' ethnicities are debated. He spent decades travelling through Central Asia and the Middle East, allegedly studying with Sufi masters, Buddhist monks, and members of obscure monastic orders. How much of this is true, and how much is mythology, nobody knows. As one academic noted, writings about Gurdjieff are often replete with erroneous dates, speculations based on hearsay, and pure invention. What is certain is that by the early 20th century, Gurdjieff had assembled a teaching system unlike anything in Western philosophy. He called it the Fourth Way, a path to consciousness that didn't require the renunciation of a monk, the physical austerity of a fakir, or the intellectual devotion of a yogi. It could be practiced in ordinary life. But it was not easy. Gurdjieff's methods were deliberately shocking. He used humiliation, contradiction, exhaustion, and confusion as teaching tools. He would invite students to elaborate dinners, ply them with food and vodka, then abruptly change the mood with a devastating personal observation. He assigned people tasks that seemed absurd, then punished them for not taking the absurdity seriously. He told wealthy, educated Europeans, people who had travelled across continents to study with him, that they were machines, that their personalities were fiction, that their emotions were mechanical reactions, no different from a thermostat clicking on when the temperature drops. Most of them stayed. Some of them were transformed. In 1922, he established the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man at a chateau in Fontainebleau, near Paris. Students lived communally, performing grueling physical labor during the day and complex movement exercises in the evening. The movements, precise, intricate dances that required total concentration, were designed to break habitual patterns and force a state of heightened awareness. If your attention wandered for even a second, you fell out of the pattern, and everyone noticed. Then came the car crash. In July 1924, Gurdjieff was driving alone from Paris to the Institute when he crashed his Citroën into a tree at approximately 90 miles per hour. He was found unconscious and was not expected to survive. His injuries were catastrophic. And here's the detail that tells you everything about the man and his followers. Some of his students believed the crash was deliberate. Another one of his teaching exercises, a test. Even as he lay broken and bleeding, they were trying to decode the lesson. His driving, for what it's worth, was legendarily terrible. He operated his automobile, according to witnesses, like he was riding a horse. After an earlier accident, he'd driven 12 hours through a forest with no memory of it. One student tried to sabotage his backup car by cutting the accelerator wire. It didn't work. The 1924 crash ended the institute, but launched Gurdjieff's writing career. Too weak to hold a pen, he dictated his masterwork, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, in a mixture of Armenian and Russian. It is, by any standard, one of the strangest books ever written. Over 1,000 pages long, deliberately difficult, written in a style designed to prevent passive reading. You cannot skim Gurdjieff. His sentences force you to pay attention, which of course was exactly the point. There's one more story I want to tell you. It captures something essential about how Gurdjieff operated. A wealthy English woman once offered him £1,000 for The Secret of Life. Gurdjieff agreed. He brought her to a restaurant, sat her down, then invited a prostitute to join them at the table. He told the prostitute he was from another planet. She laughed. He ordered food. When it arrived, he asked the prostitute what it tasted like. She said, "Cherries." Gurdjieff turned to the English woman. "That's the secret of life." She called him a charlatan. She paid him the money anyway, and she became one of his most devoted students. What did it mean? I have my theory. You probably have yours. Gurdjieff would say that the fact that you're trying to figure it out intellectually, trying to decode it, categorize it, file it away as a lesson, is the problem. The prostitute tasted cherries. She was there. She experienced the moment directly, without analysis, without interpretation, without the endless mental commentary that separates us from actual experience. That's being awake. According to Gurdjieff, most of us never get there. We live in our heads, reacting to thoughts about thoughts about thoughts, while the actual cherry, the actual moment of being alive, passes by unnoticed. Modern neuroscience has a name for this: the default mode network, the brain's autopilot system that runs when you're not paying attention. It generates the ceaseless internal monologue, the daydreaming, the rumination. Research shows that most people spend nearly half their waking hours in this state. Mind-wandering. Not here. Gurdjieff described this in 1920. Neuroscientists confirmed it in 2010. Man lives his life in sleep. 90 years before brain imaging proved it, a man with a shattered body and a mysterious past, dictating from a cot in Fontainebleau, already knew. His dangerous idea wasn't that you're asleep. His dangerous idea was that waking up is possible. Difficult, painful, requiring the kind of sustained, brutal self-honesty that most people will do anything to avoid, but possible. And if you've been listening this far, if you're still here in the quiet dark, with these stories settling into you like sediment at the bottom of a river, then maybe, just maybe, you're a little more awake than you were 3 hours ago. Alan Watts told the Western world something it was not prepared to hear. You are not a separate ego trapped inside a bag of skin. That's it. That's the dangerous idea. You, the thing you think of as you, the little voice inside your head that narrates your life, the personality you've spent decades constructing, the name on your driver's license, the face in the mirror, that isn't real. It's a fiction. An extremely useful fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. Watts argued that the sensation of being a separate self, isolated from the rest of the universe, is the fundamental illusion that causes all human suffering. He called it the skin-encapsulated ego, the false belief that the boundary of your skin is the boundary of your being, that inside is you and outside is not you. But look at it this way, he said. You didn't come into this world. You came out of it. The way a wave comes out of the ocean, you're not a stranger visiting the universe. You are the universe, a particular pattern of the universe, temporarily organized into a walking, talking, thinking form. You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. This wasn't mystical hand-waving. Watts could back it up with rigorous philosophical argument, drawing on decades of study in Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Vedanta philosophy, but he delivered it in a way that no academic philosopher ever had. In plain English, with a warm baritone voice, a mischievous wit, and a glass of vodka in his hand. Watts's life trajectory was one of the strangest in modern intellectual history. Born in 1915 in Chislehurst, England, he became secretary of the London Buddhist Lodge at 16. He was fascinated by Eastern philosophy from childhood. He published his first book, The Spirit of Zen, at 21. Then he did something nobody expected. He moved to America, entered seminary, and became an Episcopal priest and chaplain at Northwestern University. Alan Watts, the Buddhist, the Taoist, the man who would later tell millions of people that organized religion was a prison, spent years wearing vestments and delivering Christian sermons. His daughter Anne later suggested he may have entered the priesthood partly to avoid military service in World War II. Whether that's true or not, the contradiction was unsustainable. In 1950, Watts left the priesthood, publicly stating that he could not reconcile his understanding of Taoism with the rigid doctrinal demands of the Church. This was professional suicide. He walked away from institutional security, a steady income, and respectability. And he walked into everything else. Watts became a freelance philosopher. He lectured at universities, gave radio talks on KPFA in Berkeley, and wrote books that sold in the millions. The Way of Zen in 1957, the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are in 1966, he was a bridge figure, translating the deepest insights of Eastern philosophy into language that Western audiences could understand without losing the essence. He was also friends with everyone: Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers. He influenced the entire humanistic psychology movement. He helped shift Western psychology from Freud's pathologizing model, "What's wrong with you?" to a growth-oriented model, "What's possible for you?" In the late 1960s, Watts lived on a houseboat in Sausalito, in a bohemian waterfront community. He was married 3 times, had 7 children, and conducted numerous affairs. His first wife wrote an anguished letter to a bishop describing the breakdown of their marriage. He was, by any conventional moral standard, a complicated man. And he was drinking himself to death. By the early 1970s, Watts was consuming a bottle of vodka daily. The man who taught millions about the illusion of the ego, about being present, about letting go of attachment, could not let go of the bottle. The contradiction was painful and obvious. His friends worried. Some pulled away. On November 16th, 1973, Alan Watts died in his sleep at his home in Druid Heights on Mount Tamalpais. He was 58 years old. Heart failure linked to alcoholism. His body was discovered at 6 in the morning and was cremated on a wood pyre on Muir Beach at 8:30 by Buddhist monks who had arrived before the authorities. His ashes were split between his library and the Green Gulch Monastery. The man who said the ego was an illusion was destroyed, in part, by his inability to escape his own. And here's what I find most remarkable about Watts. He knew. He called himself a genuine fake, a phrase his biographer Monica Furlong used as the title of her book about him. He was under no illusions about his own contradictions. He described himself as a philosophical entertainer, a genuine fake, an irreducible rascal. When a student at a Zen center disparaged Watts by saying, "We used to think he was profound until we found the real thing," the great Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, a man of legendary self-control, erupted with sudden intensity. "You completely miss the point about Alan Watts. You should notice what he has done. He is a great bodhisattva." A bodhisattva. In Buddhist tradition, that's a being who delays their own enlightenment to help all other beings reach theirs. The highest possible compliment. From a man who did not give compliments lightly. And Suzuki was right. Because what Watts did, what no one else managed to do as effectively, was open a door. Millions of Westerners heard his voice and for the first time genuinely entertained the possibility that their entire sense of self might be a construct, that the boundaries they took for granted between self and other, between human and nature, between observer and observed, might not be real. Watts didn't just teach philosophy. He gave people permission to question the most basic assumption of their existence, that they are separate. 50 years after his death, his lectures have experienced an extraordinary revival on YouTube and podcasts. His talks have been viewed hundreds of millions of times. His voice, warm, playful, precise, has introduced more people to Eastern philosophy than any academic, any monk, any guru in history. He appears in the TV show Loki. He's sampled in electronic music tracks. His words are quoted by entrepreneurs, therapists, neuroscientists, and teenagers on social media. You are the universe experiencing itself. The man who said that is dead, has been for over 50 years. But the idea, the dangerous, destabilizing, liberating idea that you are not what you think you are, that the boundary between you and everything else is imaginary, that the universe is not something you observe, but something you are. That idea is more alive now than it has ever been. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as the boundary between waking and dreaming begins to dissolve, as the noise of the day fades and something quieter takes its place, maybe you'll catch a glimpse of what Watts was pointing at. Not through your mind, through the silence behind it. "23 thinkers, 23 dangerous ideas, and one thread that runs through every single story you've heard tonight. The truth will always be dangerous. Not because truth is harmful. It isn't. Truth is dangerous because it threatens the comfortable lies we build our lives around. Semmelweis was killed for suggesting that doctors should wash their hands. Not because hand-washing was radical, because the implication was unbearable, that the people we trust might be the ones hurting us. Bruno was burned alive for imagining an infinite universe, not because infinity was threatening to ordinary people, because it threatened the Church's claim to cosmic authority. Oppenheimer was destroyed for opposing the weapons he created, not because his opposition was wrong, because it challenged the machinery of power that had built itself around the bomb. Diogenes was dismissed as a madman for needing nothing, because a man who needs nothing cannot be controlled. Spinoza was cursed for 370 years for suggesting that God and nature are the same thing, because if God is everywhere, no institution has a monopoly on the divine. Galileo was forced to kneel and deny what his own eyes had shown him, because observation without permission is the most dangerous act in any authoritarian system. Darwin hid his truth for 20 years, partly out of love, because the most revolutionary ideas don't just change the world, they change the people you love. Blake wrote his revolution in acid and copper, invisible to the senses, because the most subversive act is to create something beautiful that cannot be controlled. Gurdjieff crashed his car at 90 miles an hour, and his students thought it was a lesson, because some ideas are so radical that even the people who believe them can't tell the difference between wisdom and madness. Marx wrote his masterwork lying on his stomach, covered in boils, while his children died around him. Because the most devastating critique of suffering was written by a man who could not escape his own. Every one of these thinkers, every single one, paid a price for seeing something the rest of the world wasn't ready to see. But here's the deeper truth, the dangerous idea behind all the dangerous ideas. It isn't hand-washing. It isn't infinity. It isn't the shadow self or the death ray, or the loaded gun on the table. The most dangerous thing you can do is think for yourself. Not follow, not obey, not accept. Not nod along because nodding is easier. Think. Look at the world with your own eyes. Draw your own conclusions. And then, this is the hard part, say them out loud. Every thinker you heard about tonight paid for that. But, and this is the part I want you to carry into your sleep tonight, the dangerous ideas won. Every single one. It took decades, sometimes centuries, but they always won. And tonight, by listening to their stories, you've chosen something too. You've chosen to sit with these uncomfortable truths, to hear the stories of people who saw the world differently and paid the price, to let their wisdom settle into you, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience, burned and beaten and ground into the very bones of human history. The question isn't whether a dangerous idea will survive. The question is whether you will have the courage to hold one. Think about that. Not now, not while you're awake. Let it find you in the quiet space between waking and sleep, in that gentle descent where the mind lets go of everything it's been holding. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings. and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.